Throughout history, 5 empires have shaped the world like no others: the Mongol, Ottoman, Roman, Persian, and British empires. But which one was the most powerful? From unstoppable armies to vast territories and cultural legacies, each empire left a lasting mark on civilization. In this video, we'll dive deep into their rise, dominance, and ultimate fall, uncovering the secrets behind their power. Stay tuned as we compare them in detail and reveal which empire truly ruled the world.
The story of the British Empire begins not in the grandeur of palaces or the opulence of monarchs, but in the humble spirit of exploration. The late 15th century saw Europe in flux. New discoveries were reshaping the world, and the long-standing age of maritime exploration had begun. By the 16th century, a small, isolated island nation in the North Atlantic, England, would lay the foundation for one of the most expansive and influential empires the world had ever seen. The Age of Exploration and the Seeds of Empire. The beginning of British imperialism traces back to the Age of Exploration, a period defined by ambitious seafaring nations looking to establish new trade routes and colonies. At the dawn of this era, England was not yet the empire that would come to dominate vast swaths of the globe. However, it was at the tail end of the 15th century that the first seeds of empire were sown, driven by 2 crucial factors: exploration and competition. In 1497, the English navigator John Cabot, under the commission of King Henry VII, sailed westward across the Atlantic. While Cabot's expedition didn't find riches or immediate territory, it paved the way for future English voyages to North America. Cabot's journey marked the beginning of England's engagement with the New World. Around the same time, Spain and Portugal were leading the charge in overseas exploration, having already established early colonies in the Americas. England, eager not to fall behind, began its own exploration efforts. In the early 1500s, England's maritime strength was still developing. Yet, a series of royal patronages and merchant-driven ventures began to catalyze the nation's involvement in global trade. The Tudor dynasty and early imperial ventures. By the early 16th century, England was ruled by the Tudor dynasty, a time of political consolidation and maritime growth. The reign of Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, was characterized by conflict with Spain, France, and Scotland, yet it also saw an increasing interest in overseas trade. While not yet an imperial power in the full sense of the word, England was steadily looking outward. Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England also laid the groundwork for a new kind of national identity that would later be central to imperial expansion. Under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558-1603, England's role in world affairs would change dramatically. Elizabeth's reign, often referred to as the Elizabethan era, was marked by the flourishing of English trade, exploration, and piracy, which were all crucial elements in the formation of the British Empire. Elizabeth, a shrewd and pragmatic monarch, authorized privateers like Sir Francis Drake to attack Spanish treasure fleets and pirate the Spanish-controlled territories in the Americas. These early pirate activities were far more than simple acts of rebellion or conquest. They were the embryonic stage of British imperial expansion. English privateers, under the guise of sea dogs, looted the riches of Spanish galleons laden with silver and gold from the Americas, funneling wealth into the coffers of England and creating a foundation for the nation's maritime dominance. The formation of the East India Company, the start of British global trade. However, it wasn't just the Spanish and Portuguese who were reaping the benefits of global trade. In the early 1600s, England's merchant class, emboldened by the wealth generated from piracy and encouraged by royal patronage, began to establish their own trading companies, the most significant being the English East India Company, founded in 1600. This company would prove to be one of the most influential forces in shaping the British Empire. The East India Company was granted a monopoly on trade in the East Indies and soon expanded its operations to India, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Initially a commercial enterprise, it would later become a semi-autonomous military force, using armed intervention and political manipulation to expand English control over vast territories. In the early 17th century, British involvement in India and the Spice Islands, present-day Indonesia, was primarily economic, but this would soon evolve into military and political control. The English Civil War and the impact on imperial expansion. Despite these early successes, England itself was embroiled in internal conflict during the 17th century. The English Civil War, 1642-1651, was a brutal struggle between the monarchy led by King Charles I and Parliament. The war resulted in the temporary overthrow of the monarchy, the execution of Charles I, and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Though the Civil War would have profound implications for England's domestic politics, it didn't hinder its global ambitions. The conflict allowed England's rivals, particularly the Spanish and French, to gain temporary advantages in Europe and overseas. However, Cromwell's government eventually recognized the importance of England's colonial ambitions, and after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, England would continue its pursuit of overseas power. The period following the Civil War was one of profound transformation for the British Empire. While England struggled with political instability, its trade routes were expanding, and its nascent empire was growing. Throughout the 17th century, England began to establish a foothold in the Caribbean and North America, laying the groundwork for the massive territorial expansions of the 18th century. The first British colonies in the Americas. The first permanent British colony in the Americas was established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Funded by the Virginia Company, Jamestown was a fragile settlement that struggled with starvation, disease, and conflict with Native American tribes. Yet it marked a critical moment in the formation of the British Empire in the New World. The early colonization of the Americas was primarily driven by economic interests, particularly the pursuit of wealth through agriculture and resource extraction. The English began to establish additional colonies along the eastern coast of North America, including Plymouth, 1620, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1629, as part of the broader Virginia Company enterprise. These colonies became sources of valuable raw materials like tobacco, timber, and fur. By the mid-17th century, the English Empire began to experience the beginnings of plantation economies, particularly in the Caribbean. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica became key hubs for sugar production, with plantations worked by enslaved Africans. This dark chapter in the British Empire's history would become an integral part of its expansion, as the transatlantic slave trade fueled the growth of both the British economy and its empire. The British Navy, the backbone of empire. One of the key components of the British Empire's success in the 17th century was its increasingly powerful navy. The Royal Navy was crucial in securing the trade routes, protecting colonies, and enforcing British dominance on the high seas. The naval victories in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, 1652 to 1674, cemented Britain's status as a maritime power and foreshadowed its dominance in the coming centuries. By the late 17th century, England had firmly established itself as one of the leading global powers, its empire expanding into the Caribbean, the Americas, and parts of Africa and Asia. The groundwork for an empire that would one day span the globe had been laid through a combination of military power, economic enterprise, and the relentless pursuit of trade. The birth of a global power. The story of the British Empire's rise is one of opportunism, ambition, and perseverance. The late 15th and 16th centuries marked the dawn of English exploration and the beginning of what would become an empire unlike any before it. From humble beginnings with figures like John Cabot and early colonies like Jamestown, England's empire would grow to dominate continents, leaving a lasting legacy in world history. But the foundations laid in these early years were just the beginning. The British Empire would grow, evolve, and expand across the globe, shaping the modern world in ways that are still felt today. This was just the beginning. The 18th century would see the British Empire expand into new territories, with the East India Company asserting control over India and the Caribbean becoming a vital economic hub. But challenges, both internal and external, would soon emerge, including rising rivalries with France and Spain, and later, the colonial struggles that would change the face of the empire forever. The impact of the 18th century: war, trade, and expansion. The 18th century was a time of intense imperial rivalry. The dominant European powers, Britain, France, and Spain, were locked in a struggle for global dominance, with each nation vying for control of valuable colonies, trade routes, and resources. But it wasn't just warfare and diplomacy that shaped this period. The rapid rise of global trade, the development of the Atlantic economy, and the growth of plantations in the New World also played crucial roles in expanding British power. In this century, Britain began to assert its dominance over vast territories, securing holdings in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. It was also during this time that the East India Company transformed from a simple trading venture into a powerful force that would eventually become the backbone of Britain's empire in the East. The War of Spanish Succession and the rise of British naval power. One of the first major conflicts of the 18th century that affected the balance of power was the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. It was primarily fought over who would succeed to the Spanish throne following the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. The war involved many European powers, but for Britain, the stakes were particularly high. Although Britain was initially drawn into the war to prevent the unification of the Spanish and French thrones under the Bourbons, the conflict ultimately had long-term benefits for Britain. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, which ended the war, granted Britain several key territorial concessions, including Gibraltar, a strategic stronghold at the entrance to the Mediterranean, and control over Minorca. This victory bolstered Britain's position as a naval power and helped to secure its dominance in the Mediterranean Sea. The acquisition of Gibraltar in particular would prove to be a major boon for British trade, providing them with an invaluable naval base that allowed them to control access between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. In the coming decades, this would serve as a cornerstone of British naval power and a vital link in the empire's vast commercial network. The Atlantic economy and the rise of plantation colonies. By the early 18th century, the British Empire's economic engine was beginning to shift. The Atlantic economy, a system of trade and production centered around the transatlantic slave trade, the production of cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and the movement of goods across the oceans, became increasingly important. This new system was built on the exploitation of enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to work on the vast plantations of the Caribbean and North America. The British Caribbean, particularly Jamaica, became one of the empire's most profitable colonies. Sugar production was the lifeblood of the British Caribbean economy, and the demand for sugar, both in Europe and in the growing markets of North America, skyrocketed. However, the vast wealth that these plantations generated was inextricably linked to one of the darkest aspects of the British Empire, the brutal system of slavery. The rise of plantations in the Caribbean also played a key role in the development of Britain's Atlantic slave trade, which became a cornerstone of the empire's economy. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled the largest and most profitable share of the transatlantic slave trade, transporting millions of enslaved Africans to work on the sugar and tobacco plantations in the Americas. In North America, British colonies such as Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas also profited from the cultivation of tobacco and later, cotton. The rise of these colonies would ultimately set the stage for Britain's involvement in the American Revolution later in the century. The Battle for India, the rise of the East India Company. The 18th century saw a chaotic period in India, marked by shifting alliances, regional conflicts, and the decline of the Mughal Empire. As the Mughal Empire began to fragment, European powers, particularly the British and the French, sought to take advantage of the power vacuum. The East India Company, which had been operating in India since the early 1600s, began to gain more influence, often acting as both a commercial enterprise and a military force. In 1757, the East India Company achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Plassey, a battle that would forever change the course of history. Led by Robert Clive, the British forces defeated the forces of the Nawab of Bengal, securing control over the rich province of Bengal in eastern India. This victory marked the beginning of British political and military dominance in India, which would last for almost 2 centuries. The success of the East India Company in India was also emblematic of the growing power of British companies and their ability to act as autonomous entities with their own armies, treaties, and political influence. The company would continue to expand its control over Indian territories, using both military might and strategic alliances to solidify British rule. The 7 Years' War, global conflict, and Britain's imperial ascendance. The mid-18th century brought about one of the most significant global conflicts of the era, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Fought across Europe, North America, and India, the war was essentially a struggle for global dominance between Britain and France. While much of the war was fought on European soil, it had far-reaching consequences for the future of the British Empire. In North America, the conflict is known as the French and Indian War, as British colonists fought alongside Native American tribes against the French and their allies. Britain's victory in the war had major consequences. It secured British dominance in North America, with France ceding Canada and the territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain. In India, the British forces, led by the East India Company, were able to defeat the French and their allies, further consolidating British power in the region. The war marked the end of French ambitions in India, paving the way for Britain to establish its colonial rule over the subcontinent. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War as the undisputed global superpower, controlling vast territories across the world. With its new possessions, Canada, large parts of India, and an expanding colonial presence in the Caribbean, Britain now stood at the pinnacle of imperial power. The British Empire's transformation into a global power. By the end of the 18th century, the British Empire was firmly established as the dominant global power. From the Caribbean to India, from the North American colonies to Africa, Britain controlled vast swaths of the globe. The empire had evolved from a collection of small, often struggling colonies into a unified, powerful force capable of shaping the course of world history. But this was only the beginning. The 19th century would see the British Empire enter a period of unprecedented expansion, fueled by industrialization, technological advances, and the exploitation of new territories. However, as the empire grew, so too did tensions and contradictions. The rise of revolutionary movements, the continued reliance on slavery, and the emerging challenges of nationalism and colonial resistance would set the stage for profound changes in the century to come. The British Empire in the 19th century, industrialization, expansion, and the rise of colonial resistance, 1800–1900. The 19th century marked a transformative period for the British Empire, one that saw its expansion to unprecedented levels. Fueled by the Industrial Revolution, Britain was poised to dominate the globe in ways never seen before. The empire expanded, its naval might grew stronger, and its reach stretched from the Indian subcontinent to the far corners of Africa, Australia, and the Pacific. Yet as the empire reached the zenith of its power, cracks began to appear beneath the surface. Internal tensions, colonial resistance, and changing global dynamics were about to reshape the British Empire forever. The Industrial Revolution, powering the empire. By the early 19th century, Britain had undergone an extraordinary transformation. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, had unleashed a wave of technological, economic, and social changes that would propel the British Empire to new heights. At the heart of this transformation were innovations in machinery, steam power, and manufacturing techniques. The development of the steam engine by James Watt revolutionized transportation and production. It allowed goods to be produced at an unprecedented scale and speed, and it powered the steamships and railways that would become essential to Britain's global empire. The Industrial Revolution also marked the rise of factories, and with them, a growing urban population. Britain's cities, Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, became hubs of industrial output. The expansion of factories required raw materials, and this need for resources spurred Britain to secure colonies rich in minerals, cotton, and other valuable goods. Britain's technological superiority allowed it to dominate world trade, bringing in goods from across the empire, including cotton from India and the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, and tea from China. As British industry boomed, so did its need for markets, raw materials, and territories to fuel its economic engine. The scramble for Africa, imperial expansion, and rivalries. While Britain's industrial dominance was crucial to its empire, it was the scramble for Africa that defined the late 19th century. Between 1880 and 1914, European powers carved up the African continent, seeking to exploit its resources and establish colonies. Britain, with its powerful navy and vast empire, was at the forefront of this expansion. Britain's colonial holdings in Africa grew rapidly during this period. British forces captured Egypt in 1882, ensuring control over the Suez Canal, a vital link to British possessions in India and the Far East. British interests also expanded into South Africa, where the discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 19th century spurred a rush for territory. Cecil Rhodes, a key figure in British colonialism, became infamous for his role in the establishment of British-controlled Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, and his vision of an empire stretching from Cape to Cairo. Britain's success in Africa was not without resistance. Indigenous African groups and emerging nationalist movements began to push back against colonial rule. This tension would continue into the 20th century, but for now, Britain's dominance over much of the continent seemed secure. The British Raj, the jewel in the crown. Perhaps the most significant territorial acquisition of the 19th century was India, often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Though British influence in India had been growing since the 17th century, it wasn't until the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Indian Mutiny or Sepoy Rebellion, that Britain formally established direct rule over the subcontinent. The Indian Rebellion was sparked by a series of grievances against British colonial policies, including the introduction of new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The rebellion spread across northern and central India, and for a time, it seemed that the British might lose their hold on the region. However, after months of intense fighting, British forces, aided by loyal Indian troops, were able to quell the uprising. In response to the rebellion, the British government decided to take direct control of India, ending the rule of the East India Company. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, marking the formal beginning of the British Raj, a period of direct British rule over India that would last until 1947. Under British rule, India underwent significant changes. British officials modernized infrastructure, building an extensive railway network, roads, and telegraph systems. The British also introduced English as a common language, established a Western-style education system, and promoted British-style institutions, such as the legal system and parliamentary governance. However, British rule was also marked by widespread exploitation and suffering. The wealth of India was siphoned off to Britain, while the Indian population endured famine, poverty, and social dislocation. The Indian National Congress and other nationalist movements began to push for greater autonomy, and by the late 19th century, the demand for independence was growing stronger. The Opium Wars and China, the dark side of imperialism. While Britain's imperial ventures in Africa and India were crucial to its global power, the Opium Wars with China in the mid-19th century revealed another, darker side of British imperialism. During the 18th and 19th centuries, British traders had developed a highly profitable trade in opium with China. The British East India Company had a monopoly on the opium trade in India, and British merchants smuggled vast quantities of the drug into China, where it led to widespread addiction. When the Chinese government attempted to curb the opium trade, Britain responded with military force. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, ended with a British victory and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain and opened several ports to British trade. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, further solidified British control in China, forcing China to legalize the opium trade and grant additional concessions to British interests. The Opium Wars were emblematic of the imperialistic policies that Britain employed across its empire. The quest for profits often took precedence over the well-being of indigenous populations, leading to exploitation, addiction, and violence in many parts of the world. Imperial tensions and the path to decline. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen, controlling vast territories across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. It was an empire built on industrial power, naval dominance, and the exploitation of colonies. However, as the 20th century approached, tensions within the empire began to rise. The sheer size of the empire posed logistical and economic challenges, as maintaining control over distant colonies became increasingly costly. Moreover, the rise of nationalism in many colonized regions, the increasing power of rival European nations, and the growing demands for independence would all pose threats to Britain's dominance. In South Africa, the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, had exposed the vulnerability of British power in Africa. The war, fought against Dutch-descended settlers, or Boers, ended in British victory but revealed the limits of British power on the African continent. Similarly, the rapid rise of German imperial ambitions and U.S. expansion in the Pacific and Caribbean put Britain in direct competition with other rising powers. Despite these challenges, the 19th century ended with Britain still at the forefront of global politics. Its empire stretched around the world, but the coming century would present new challenges, both internally and externally, that would test the resilience of the British Empire. The pinnacle of empire and the seeds of change. The 19th century was a time of immense growth and wealth for the British Empire. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into the world's most powerful nation, and its empire expanded across the globe, bringing immense profits from colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Yet, as Britain reached the pinnacle of its imperial power, the seeds of resistance and change were being sown. The growing demand for independence in India, the tensions in Africa, and the rise of new imperial rivals would soon challenge the foundations of the empire. The British Empire, while still vast, was beginning to show signs of strain. The 20th century would bring both the zenith of British power and the beginning of its eventual decline. In the next section, we'll explore how the empire would face the challenges of two world wars, the rise of nationalist movements, and the slow unraveling of its colonial possessions. The empire, once the world's greatest power, was about to enter a period of dramatic change. But before that, Britain would have to navigate the fires of war, shifting alliances, and the rise of a new global order. The decline of the British Empire, world wars, decolonization, and the end of empire, 1900-1947. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever known. Its global influence spanned from India to the Caribbean, from Africa to the Pacific. But the seeds of decline were beginning to take root. The challenges of maintaining such an expansive empire were growing, and soon, two devastating world wars would fundamentally alter the global order. The story of the British Empire in the 20th century is not just one of imperial glory, but of its eventual unraveling. In this chapter of the British Empire's history, we will explore how global conflict, economic strain, and rising nationalist movements led to the disintegration of Britain's imperial holdings. From the trenches of World War I to the eventual independence of India in 1947, the British Empire would face its greatest challenges yet, and ultimately be forced to cede its global dominance. World War I, the Empire at War. The first of these challenges came with the outbreak of World War I, 1914-1918, a conflict that would change the course of history. The war was fought primarily between the Allies, including Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. For Britain, the war was not only a European struggle, but a global conflict, as its empire was spread across the world. The British Empire entered the war as one of the major global powers. The empire's colonies and dominions, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India, were all heavily involved in the war effort, sending troops to fight on multiple fronts, from Europe to the Middle East to Africa. The Indian Army, for example, provided more than 1 million soldiers, making it one of the largest volunteer forces in history. Despite being a victorious power in World War I, Britain's imperial might would be severely tested during and after the war. The war drained Britain's finances, and the cost of maintaining the empire became increasingly unsustainable. The war also sparked political and social changes in the colonies, as people across the empire began to demand greater political representation and independence. The impact of World War I on the British Empire. World War I had profound consequences for the British Empire. In addition to the staggering loss of life, over 900,000 British soldiers died and millions more were wounded. The war accelerated the rise of nationalist movements in Britain's colonies. The devastation caused by the war, along with the promises of self-determination and independence made by the British government during the war, set the stage for the eventual end of empire. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, further complicated Britain's position in the Middle East. Britain's mandates over former Ottoman territories, including Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, placed it at the heart of political and religious turmoil in the region. In India, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919, in which British troops killed hundreds of unarmed Indian civilians, sparked widespread outrage and resentment. The incident marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and India. Indian nationalists, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, began to push for greater autonomy and eventual independence. The interwar years, the rise of nationalism and global changes. The period between the two world wars saw increasing pressure on the British Empire from both internal and external forces. The interwar years were marked by rising nationalist movements within the empire, as colonies demanded more autonomy and self-determination. At the same time, the global political landscape was shifting, as new powers like the United States and the Soviet Union began to challenge Britain's dominance. In Ireland, Britain faced its first major challenge to its control in the British Isles. After years of tension and armed resistance, the Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, resulted in the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, marking the first major loss for the British Empire in the 20th century. In India, Mahatma Gandhi emerged as the leader of a nonviolent movement for independence. Gandhi's campaign of civil disobedience and non-cooperation with British authorities gained widespread support, especially after the brutal repression of Indian protests. Britain's refusal to grant India self-rule led to increasing tensions, culminating in mass protests, strikes, and violence. Across Africa and the Caribbean, nationalist movements also began to gain traction. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Marcus Garvey in Jamaica were laying the groundwork for the independence movements that would emerge after World War II. World War II, the strain on the British Empire. While the interwar period had already shown signs of strain, World War II, 1939-1945, would be the final blow to the British Empire's global dominance. The war had devastating consequences, not only in terms of military loss, but also in terms of economic destruction. Britain, already weakened by the Great Depression, had to fight the Axis powers, primarily Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, on multiple fronts. The war saw massive involvement from Britain's colonies. India, Africa, and the Caribbean sent troops, materials, and financial support to Britain's war effort. However, as with World War I, the costs of the war were astronomical. Britain was left with a massive national debt and a crippled economy. In Asia, Japan's invasion of British territories, including Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, highlighted the vulnerabilities of Britain's imperial holdings. The loss of Singapore in 1942, once considered the Gibraltar of the East, was a humiliating blow to British prestige and the symbol of British imperial might in Asia. The end of empire, decolonization, and the road to independence. By the end of World War II, the British Empire was on the brink of collapse. The war had left Britain economically drained, politically weakened, and socially divided. The empire, which had been built on military power, exploitation, and trade, was increasingly unsustainable in the face of rising nationalist movements and the changing global order. The first major step toward decolonization came in 1947 with the independence of India. After decades of resistance, protests, and negotiations led by figures like Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, Britain was forced to grant India independence. However, the partition of India into two separate nations, India and Pakistan, resulted in mass violence, displacement, and the deaths of millions, marking a painful chapter in the history of British colonial rule. India's independence was followed by a wave of decolonization across the empire. In the 1950s and 1960s, former colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, including Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, and Kenya, gained independence, marking the official end of British colonial rule in much of the world. Britain, now weakened by war and decolonization, found itself unable to maintain its former imperial grandeur. In 1947, the British Empire was reduced to the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, many of which had gained independence. The Post-Imperial World, the Legacy of the British Empire, 1947, present. The British Empire, once the most powerful and expansive empire in history, collapsed in the mid-20th century. But even as the empire faded away, its legacy continued to shape the world in profound and lasting ways. In this chapter, we explore the impact of the British Empire on the modern world, on the former colonies, on Britain itself, and on global politics, culture, and economics. Though the empire may have disintegrated politically, the structures, institutions, and ideologies it created would continue to influence countries around the globe. From language and legal systems to economic models and political relationships, the British Empire's legacy is visible in nearly every corner of the world today. The end of empire and the rise of the Commonwealth. In the aftermath of decolonization, Britain found itself in a new role. Once the heart of a global empire, it now faced a post-imperial reality. The end of colonial rule left Britain without its vast global network of territories, yet it was still tied to its former colonies through the British Commonwealth of Nations. Established in the early 20th century, the Commonwealth became the loose association of former colonies that remained united by shared historical, political, and economic ties to Britain. Though many of Britain's former colonies had gained independence, they retained symbolic and sometimes practical connections to the British Crown. The Commonwealth, though not a political union, has remained an important forum for collaboration between Britain and former colonies, even as the global balance of power shifted. Some countries, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, retained their status as Commonwealth realms, recognizing the British monarch as their head of state. Others, like India and South Africa, adopted republics but kept ties with Britain through shared institutions and cooperation on various global issues. However, the nature of these relationships has evolved over time, and the idea of a post-imperial Britain became a complex one. The once immense empire was now a nation grappling with the challenges of a smaller, more interconnected world. Economic and social impact, from imperial power to post-war recovery. Following the decolonization period, Britain had to adjust to its new place in the world. The costs of maintaining the empire had drained Britain's resources, and the aftermath of both World War I and World War II had left the country in economic disarray. The loss of empire coincided with the rise of new economic powers, such as the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union, making Britain's post-imperial future more uncertain. In the 1950s and 1960s, Britain turned inward to focus on its own economic recovery. The National Health Service, NHS, was established in 1948, marking a shift toward welfare state policies that would characterize much of the post-war era. Social reforms, such as the expansion of education and the creation of a social safety net, aimed to modernize the nation's economy and improve the living standards of its citizens. At the same time, however, Britain struggled to compete with emerging global powers. The empire had provided Britain with access to vast resources, markets, and manpower, advantages that were now gone. To maintain its global position, Britain sought to strengthen its ties with other European nations, eventually becoming a member of the European Economic Community (EEC) in 1973, later to become the European Union. However, these post-imperial adjustments were far from easy. The loss of colonies and the decline of Britain's industrial base led to economic challenges, high unemployment, and labor unrest. Moreover, the process of decolonization had created emotional and social tensions in Britain, particularly among those who had worked in or had connections to the colonies. The legacy and former colonies, independence and nation building. While Britain's relationship with its former colonies evolved, those colonies also had to navigate the complex reality of independence. Newly formed nations were tasked with building stable governments, economies, and national identities, often in the face of inherited problems such as ethnic divisions, poverty, and underdevelopment. For many of Britain's former colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the legacy of colonial rule was both a burden and an opportunity. On one hand, British colonialism left behind modern infrastructure, legal systems, and a common language in English. On the other hand, colonial rule had also entrenched social hierarchies, exploited local resources, and suppressed local cultures. In India, the British legacy remains a mixed one. India gained independence in 1947, But the partition of the country into India and Pakistan resulted in widespread violence and displacement. The British imposition of borders, particularly in places like Kashmir and Bangladesh, left lasting conflicts that continue to shape regional geopolitics today. In Africa, many nations gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s, but the legacies of British colonialism are complex. The artificial borders drawn by the British in Africa often grouped together rival ethnic and religious groups, leading to decades of political instability and civil wars. Former British colonies like Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana have seen both successes and struggles in their post-independence development. The British Empire's colonial past also left an indelible mark on Caribbean countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados. The legacy of slavery and the plantation economy continues to influence the social, economic, and political systems of these nations today. These cultural legacy, language, literature, and institutions. One of the most enduring legacies of the British Empire is the widespread use of the English language. English has become the global lingua franca, spoken by millions of people around the world as either a first or second language. It is the language of international business, diplomacy, science, and popular culture. The British Empire played a key role in spreading English around the world, and today the language continues to bind former colonies to Britain in ways that are both practical and cultural. The cultural influence of Britain extends beyond language. British literature, philosophy, and legal traditions are also foundational to many modern societies. Countries like India, Australia, and South Africa continue to use British common law as the basis for their legal systems, while British educational models have shaped the curriculum in schools and universities across the globe. Britain's legacy in the arts is also significant. Writers like William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and George Orwell are read and revered in countries worldwide. British music, film, and television continue to be influential globally, from the Beatles to James Bond to Harry Potter. Post-empire tensions, migration, identity, and globalization. The post-imperial era has not been without its challenges, particularly in terms of migration and identity. The loss of empire created a new wave of immigration to Britain, as people from former colonies moved to the metropole in search of better opportunities. Caribbean, Indian, and Pakistani communities began to settle in Britain in the mid-20th century, leading to both cultural enrichment and racial tension. For many, the presence of these immigrant communities brought questions about national identity, race, and multiculturalism. The process of decolonization in the mid-20th century coincided with significant demographic changes in Britain, as immigrants from the former colonies contributed to the country's economic recovery, particularly in industries like transportation, healthcare, and manufacturing. However, the growing diversity also led to tensions. Racial discrimination and the rise of nationalist political movements in Britain reflected the discomfort many felt with the changing social fabric. The legacy of empire was now being contested by those who had been part of it, as well as by those who were now in Britain's cities and neighborhoods, challenging the very foundations of British identity. The enduring legacy of the British Empire. Though the British Empire may have ended politically, its legacy continues to shape the modern world. From language and culture to global trade and politics, the empire's influence is still felt. The post-imperial world is a complex, interconnected place, where former colonies have forged their own identities while still grappling with the legacies of colonial rule. For Britain, the decline of empire marked the end of an era, but it also ushered in new challenges and opportunities. The former imperial power, now part of a globalized world, continues to navigate its relationship with the Commonwealth and its place in international affairs. The post-imperial world and the future of global politics, 21st century and beyond. The British Empire, once the most powerful entity in the world, has long since faded into history. But its influence continues to echo in the geopolitics, economics, and cultures of the modern world. As the 21st century unfolds, the world is shaped by the enduring legacies of imperialism, not only in the former colonies, but also in the former colonial powers themselves. The question now is, how will these legacies continue to shape the global order in the years to come? And what does the future hold for the nations once controlled by the British Empire? In this final chapter, we will explore the continuing influence of the British Empire in the post-imperial era, how the global power dynamics have shifted, and the role of former empires in a rapidly changing world. As we look to the future, we will also consider the potential for reconciliation, growth, and redefined international relations between former imperial powers and their former colonies. The rise of a new global order, multipolarity, and the decline of Western hegemony. The world today is no longer dominated by a single power or a few large empires. Following the decline of European colonial empires in the mid-20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union became the two superpowers that shaped the global landscape through the Cold War. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the 21st century has witnessed the rise of new global players, leading to a more multipolar world. In this new global order, China, India, and other emerging economies have begun to challenge the dominance of the West, reshaping the geopolitical landscape. As the former imperial powers, including Britain, struggle with internal challenges like Brexit, rising populism, and economic inequality, countries from the global south have gained more influence on the global stage. The traditional dominance of the United States, Britain, and Europe is being diluted by a growing chorus of voices from former colonies, now asserting their rights to define the future of global politics. China, in particular, has emerged as a major player, asserting its influence in Africa, Asia, and beyond. As Beijing expands its Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure and trade across former British colonies and other parts of the developing world, it presents an alternative vision of economic development and political order, one that is not rooted in Western values but in a more diverse, multipolar system. Similarly, India, the world's most populous democracy and a former jewel of the British Empire, has risen as a global power in its own right. It has emerged as a key player in international trade, technology, and diplomacy, often advocating for the rights of developing nations on the world stage. The growing importance of India, coupled with its strategic alliances with Western nations, signals the shifting dynamics of global influence and power. The legacy of empire in contemporary geopolitics. Despite the shifting power dynamics, the legacy of the British Empire continues to influence international relations in a variety of ways. The Commonwealth of Nations, which began as an imperial network, remains an enduring symbol of Britain's connections with its former colonies. The Commonwealth, though no longer a political entity, provides a platform for former British colonies to cooperate on issues ranging from trade to education to human rights. However, the Commonwealth is not without its challenges. The post-imperial relationship between Britain and former colonies is often fraught with tensions, particularly over historical injustices like slavery, colonial violence, and the legacy of racism. Calls for reparations, justice, and recognition of historical wrongs have become more prominent, with some nations, such as Jamaica, Barbados, and others, demanding reparations for the exploitation of enslaved people and the colonial extraction of wealth. In addition, the British monarchy, while a largely symbolic institution today, still plays a central role in the relationship between Britain and some former colonies. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand maintain the British monarch as their head of state, while others, like Barbados in 2021, have chosen to sever ties with the monarchy and establish republics. The debate over the monarchy's role in the post-imperial world continues to be a subject of discussion, particularly as many countries grapple with their national identity and sovereignty in the 21st century. The Brexit referendum in 2016 further illustrated the complexities of Britain's relationship with its former colonies. The decision to leave the European Union raised questions about Britain's future in the global order and its connections to the former imperial territories that now make up the Commonwealth. As Britain navigates its new role in a post-Brexit world, its historical ties to former colonies will continue to shape its foreign policy and its place in global governance. Decolonization, neocolonialism, and the post-imperial economic landscape. While much of the British Empire has formally dissolved, the economic relationships that were forged during the imperial era still shape much of the global economy. In many former colonies, particularly in Africa and parts of Asia, the patterns of trade, investment, and development often continue to favor former imperial powers. Critics argue that this represents a form of neocolonialism, where wealthy Western nations continue to extract resources and maintain economic dominance over former colonies, despite their political independence. One of the most notable aspects of this economic legacy is the financial system. The City of London, for instance, continues to be one of the world's most important financial hubs, and British multinational corporations maintain substantial interests in former colonies. Furthermore, global trade routes, supply chains, and economic policies often trace their origins back to the structures established during the colonial era. At the same time, however, the rise of new economic powers in the global south is challenging these old dynamics. China, India, and countries in Africa are increasingly setting their own economic agendas, seeking alternative partnerships that do not rely on Western institutions or models of development. The expansion of trade agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, and China's growing influence in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are indicative of a shift away from Western-dominated economic systems. The cultural legacy, identity, race, and reconciliation. The cultural impact of the British Empire is another powerful legacy that continues to shape the post-imperial world. The spread of English as a global language is a lasting symbol of the empire's reach, but the cultural exchange, and often cultural domination, of the colonial era also left deep imprints on language, literature, and society. For many in the former colonies, the legacy of British colonialism is inextricably linked to complex identities that navigate between the colonial past and the modern, globalized present. The struggle for cultural preservation in former colonies, alongside the integration of Western influences, often creates tensions that reflect the complexity of post-imperial identity. Migration has played a central role in this process. In the aftermath of decolonization, waves of migration from former colonies to Britain reshaped British society, especially in cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Today, Britain is home to one of the most diverse populations in Europe, and issues of race, ethnicity, and multiculturalism are at the forefront of political and social discourse. Cultural restitution and the debate over the return of stolen artifacts from British museums have also become central issues in recent years. The Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles, and countless other cultural treasures were taken from colonized nations during the imperial era, and calls for their return are growing louder. Looking to the future, a post-imperial global order? As we look to the future, we face an increasingly complex world where power, economics, and culture are no longer dominated by any single nation or region. The former empires, including Britain, have had to adapt to this new reality, with some seeking to redefine their roles in an interconnected world, and others grappling with the challenges of their past. For the countries that were once part of the British Empire, the journey of nation-building, economic development, and social reconciliation is ongoing. While many have achieved impressive growth and success, others continue to struggle with the legacies of poverty, inequality, and political instability that were exacerbated by colonial rule. Yet there is also a growing recognition of the importance of multilateralism, where nations, regardless of their colonial history, must work together to address global challenges: climate change, economic inequality, terrorism, and human rights. The British Empire's legacy, while undeniable, is being reframed in the context of a globalized world where former colonies are no longer subjugated to imperial power, but instead are powerful actors in their own right. Conclusion. The legacy lives on. The story of the British Empire is a tale of rise and fall, of global dominance and inevitable decline. It is a story of exploration, conquest, exploitation, and resistance. And though the empire itself is long gone, its legacy endures. The former British colonies, once subjects of imperial rule, have evolved into dynamic, independent nations that are shaping the future of the world. Britain, for its part, continues to grapple with its past while navigating its place in a rapidly changing world. As we move further into the 21st century, the world is witnessing the rise of new powers, the reshaping of global alliances, and the increasing importance of global cooperation. And through it all, the legacy of the British Empire, complicated, multifaceted, and often contentious, will continue to influence the geopolitics, economics, and culture of the modern world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the British Empire. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of its complexities, its triumphs, its failures, and its enduring impact on the world today. Stay tuned for more documentaries and explorations into history's greatest legacies. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with those who want to understand the forces that have shaped our modern world.
Rome, one of the greatest empires in history. From humble beginnings as a village by the Tiber River to ruling the known world, Rome's story is one of power, ambition, and eventual decline. But its legacy, that lives on today in our laws, governments, and cities. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through Rome's rise, its golden age, and the forces that brought it down. Get ready to explore the complete history of Rome, from its legendary founding to its fall, and the enduring mark it left on civilization. The mythical foundation of Rome. The story of Rome's founding is shrouded in myth, and the most famous version comes from the Roman poet Virgil's epic, the Aeneid. According to Virgil, the founding of Rome begins with the fall of Troy. The hero Aeneas, a Trojan prince, escapes the burning city with his followers and sails across the Mediterranean in search of a new homeland. After a long and arduous journey, he reaches the Italian coast, where he and his people establish a new settlement. But while Virgil's tale is the most celebrated, it's not the only one. The Roman historian Livy, in his work Ab Urbe Condita, From the Founding of the City, tells another version of the founding myth. According to Livy, Rome was founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. The twins were born to the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. Abandoned at birth and left to die by the banks of the Tiber River, they were miraculously saved by a she-wolf who nursed them. Later, the twins were raised by a shepherd, Faustulus. When Romulus and Remus grew up, they learned of their royal lineage and decided to found a city. The brothers disagreed on where to build their new settlement, leading to a conflict that ended with Romulus killing Remus. In 753 BCE, Romulus became the first king of Rome, and the city was born from the ashes of their fraternal strife. Thus, Rome was established on the Palatine Hill, a place that would later become the heart of the Roman Empire. While the story of Romulus and Remus is legendary, it reflects the values and themes that would shape Rome's identity: resilience, divine favor, and the spirit of determination. The early kingdom. For the next 2.5 centuries, Rome was a kingdom, ruled by a succession of 7 kings. These early kings are considered semi-mythical figures, and their reigns are intertwined with legend and historical fact. While the accuracy of their reigns is debated, each king played a pivotal role in Rome's development. Let's briefly look at each of the 7 kings. Romulus, 753 to 717 BCE, the founder of Rome and its first king. Under his rule, Rome established its first laws, military structure, and the Senate. Romulus also led Rome in its first major war against the neighboring Sabines. During this conflict, the famous rape of the Sabine women occurred, a story in which Romulus and his men abducted women from the Sabine tribe to take as wives. Though violent, this event helped Rome grow and integrate the Sabine people into Roman society. Numa Pompilius, 717 to 673 BCE, Numa, a Sabine, became Rome's second king. He is credited with introducing many of the religious and social customs that would define Roman life, including the establishment of the Roman calendar and the role of the priesthood. Tullus Hostilius, 673 to 642 BCE. Known for his military prowess, Tullus expanded Rome's territory through war, notably defeating the neighboring Alban League. His reign marked a shift towards a more aggressive expansionist policy. Ancus Marcius, 642 to 617 BCE, Ancus, a grandson of Numa, focused on Rome's growth by building infrastructure, including the construction of the first bridge across the Tiber River and the founding of the port city of Ostia. Tarquinius Priscus, 616 to 578 BCE, an Etruscan, Tarquin was an ambitious and capable king who focused on major public works, including the construction of the Roman Forum and the Circus Maximus. His reign marked the beginning of Rome's expansion beyond its original territory. Servius Tullius, 578 to 535 BCE. Known for his social reforms, Servius Tullius restructured Roman society, dividing the population into classes based on wealth. This system would later evolve into the census, a key element in Roman governance. He also expanded Rome's territory further through both military conquest and alliances. Tarquinius Superbus, 535 to 509 BCE, the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant. His reign was marked by excessive power and disregard for the Senate. His actions led to his downfall, and he was eventually overthrown, bringing an end to the monarchy. The monarchy of Rome was not destined to last forever. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, was a cruel and unpopular ruler. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place, Rome would establish a republic, a system that would shape the course of Western civilization for centuries. The transition from monarchy to republic wasn't a smooth one. It was the result of a deeply troubling event, the rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman who was assaulted by the son of Tarquin the Proud. Her tragic death and the resulting public outrage led to the overthrow of the monarchy in 509 BCE. The Romans vowed never again to allow one man to hold absolute power, and thus the Roman Republic was born, the establishment of the Republic. In 509 BCE, the Romans decided to reject the idea of monarchy and instead created a republic, a system of government in which power rested in the hands of the people, or more accurately, in the hands of their elected representatives. The early republic was a delicate balance between two powerful groups, the patricians, the aristocratic class, and the plebeians, the common people. The transition was not easy. The people, scarred by the abuses of the monarchy, were deeply distrustful of centralized power. So, the Romans created a system of checks and balances, dividing power among various branches of government. The central authority in the early republic was vested in two consuls, who were elected annually and held executive powers. They served as the military commanders and highest judges of the republic. But crucially, their powers were limited by the fact that they could only hold office for 1 year, ensuring that no individual could amass too much power. Alongside the consuls was the Senate, a body composed of Rome's most influential men. The Senate initially played an advisory role, but gradually gained more control over foreign policy, financial matters, and legislation. Despite the ideal of a shared power structure, the early republic was not a democracy as we know it today. Only patricians had the right to vote and hold office, while plebeians had little political influence. This imbalance led to tensions between the patricians and plebeians, culminating in the conflict of the orders, a series of struggles between the two classes that spanned over 2 centuries. The plebeians sought political equality, land redistribution, and legal protection from the arbitrary power of the patricians. Through a series of strikes, protests, and negotiations, the plebeians gradually gained more rights. The most significant of these victories was the creation of the Tribune of the Plebs, a new political office designed to represent the common people. Tribunes had the power to veto legislation that they felt was harmful to the plebeians, providing them with a crucial check on the patricians' power. The Roman army and early expansion. At the heart of Rome's early success was its military. The Roman army was unique, not just because of its discipline and strategy, but because of the way it was structured. Unlike other armies of the time, the Roman legions were composed of Roman citizens, ordinary men who were trained and organized into military units. The Roman army's success was largely due to the manipular formation, which allowed soldiers to fight more flexibly and effectively than their enemies. This formation, combined with strict discipline and a deep commitment to Roman values, made the Roman army one of the most powerful fighting forces in the ancient world. In the early years of the Republic, Rome's military campaigns were focused on securing its own borders and defending against neighboring tribes. The Latin League, a coalition of cities in central Italy, and the Etruscans to the north, were among the first to challenge Rome's growing influence. Through a series of successful wars, Rome gradually expanded its territory. Rome's first major expansion came through its wars with the neighboring Sabines and Etruscans, followed by its conquest of the Latin cities. Over the course of the next few centuries, Rome would fight numerous wars, both internal and external, as it grew from a small city-state into a dominant force in the Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars. One of the defining events in Rome's early expansion was its conflict with Carthage, a powerful city-state located in North Africa. This series of wars, known as the Punic Wars, would change the course of Roman history forever. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, began over control of the strategic island of Sicily. At the time, Carthage was a dominant naval power, while Rome was primarily a land-based military force. However, Rome's naval innovation allowed it to build a formidable fleet, and after several years of intense naval and land battles, Rome emerged victorious, gaining control of Sicily, which became its first overseas province. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, was even more catastrophic. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, famous for crossing the Alps with his army and war elephants, brought Rome to the brink of defeat. His victory at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where he annihilated a Roman army, remains one of the most devastating defeats in Roman military history. But despite this setback, Rome's resilience came to the fore. Under the leadership of generals like Scipio Africanus, the Romans eventually turned the tide of the war. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio decisively defeated Hannibal, marking the end of the Second Punic War. Carthage was forced to sue for peace, and Rome emerged as the preeminent power in the Western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, would see the complete destruction of Carthage. After years of Roman suspicion and hostility, Rome laid siege to Carthage and after a brutal 3-year siege, utterly destroyed the city. The surviving Carthaginians were sold into slavery, and the city itself was burned to the ground. Rome's victory in the Punic Wars solidified its dominance and marked the beginning of its imperial expansion. Rome's imperial expansion and wealth. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic had transformed from a city-state into a vast empire. Rome now controlled much of the Mediterranean world, including modern-day Spain, France, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and parts of North Africa. As a result, Rome's wealth grew exponentially. The Republic was rich in resources, but this wealth came at a cost. Roman citizens, especially the wealthy patricians, benefited from the empire's conquests. The spoils of war flowed into the Republic, filling the coffers of the elite and leading to significant economic inequality. Large estates called latifundia were established in newly conquered territories. These estates were worked by slaves, often taken from the conquered peoples, and became the backbone of Roman agriculture. However, while the wealthy elite thrived, the common citizens, the plebeians, faced economic hardship. Small farmers who had once formed the backbone of Rome's military found themselves displaced by the growing number of latifundia. Many of these farmers were forced to sell their land and migrate to Rome in search of work, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. This economic inequality would be one of the factors that contributed to political unrest in the Republic. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, combined with the growing number of disenfranchised citizens, led to tensions that would eventually tear the Republic apart. The Gracchi brothers and the Reform movement. The first signs of political unrest appeared in the late 2nd century BCE, with the efforts of 2 brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, to reform the Republic's social and political system. The Gracchi brothers, both of noble birth, sought to address the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. Tiberius Gracchus, elected as a tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, proposed a series of land reforms aimed at redistributing land from the wealthy elite to the poor farmers. His plan was simple: limit the amount of land one person could own and redistribute excess land to the landless poor. Tiberius's proposal angered the Senate, which was made up primarily of the wealthy patricians. The senators saw the land reforms as a direct threat to their power and wealth. In response, Tiberius faced fierce opposition from the elite, and his efforts to pass the reforms were met with violence. In 133 BCE, Tiberius was assassinated by a group of political opponents, marking a tragic end to his campaign for social justice. But his death did not end the push for reform. His brother Gaius Gracchus took up the mantle of reform in 123 BCE. Gaius proposed even more radical reforms, including land redistribution, subsidized grain for the poor, and the extension of Roman citizenship to non-Romans in Italy. His efforts to weaken the Senate's power and introduce populist policies earned him the loyalty of the urban poor, but also created fierce opposition from the elite. Like his brother, Gaius was ultimately killed in 121 BCE by political enemies. Despite their tragic fates, the Gracchi brothers had ignited a spark of social and political change in Rome. a spark that would continue to smolder for years. The rise of military leaders and political turmoil. The years following the deaths of the Gracchi brothers were marked by further political instability. The social and economic divisions in Roman society deepened, and the Senate's authority was increasingly challenged by military leaders. These leaders, who commanded Rome's legions, were able to use their military successes to gain power in the political sphere. One of the most notable figures to emerge during this time was Gaius Marius, a military general who became consul in 107 BCE. Marius reformed the Roman army, allowing the landless poor to join the legions. This change was revolutionary. Previously, only property-owning citizens could serve in the army. But by opening the military to the poor, Marius created a new, loyal fighting force that owed its allegiance directly to their commander, rather than to the Senate or the state. Marius's reforms transformed the Roman military into a powerful tool of political influence. In 88 BCE, Marius found himself in a bitter struggle with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, another ambitious general. Sulla and Marius fought a brutal civil war for control of Rome, with Sulla ultimately emerging victorious. Sulla's victory marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman politics, the increasing dominance of military leaders over the Senate. Sulla's dictatorship, which he held from 82 to 79 BCE, was marked by bloody purges of his political enemies. He restored the power of the Senate, but his reign also revealed the vulnerability of the Republic. Sulla's actions set a dangerous precedent, showing that military might could be used to achieve political power. The political instability continued throughout the 1st century BCE, as Rome's growing empire faced increasing internal strife. The struggle for power, combined with the Republic's inherent weaknesses, would lead to the rise of one final dominant figure, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's rise to power. Julius Caesar, born in 100 BCE, was a man of extraordinary ambition. Coming from a relatively noble, though not particularly wealthy family, he sought to climb the political ladder through charisma, political alliances, and military conquest. In 60 BCE, Caesar formed a powerful political alliance known as the First Triumvirate with two of the most powerful men in Rome: Pompey the Great, a celebrated military general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This alliance allowed the three men to dominate Roman politics, sidelining the Senate and the traditional political structure. But despite their power, the alliance was fragile. Crassus was killed in 53 BCE during the ill-fated Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians in the east, leaving Pompey and Caesar to compete for dominance. With Crassus out of the picture, tensions between Pompey and Caesar intensified. Pompey, who had been granted enormous military commands in the east, sought to increase his influence in Rome. But Caesar, who had already proven his military prowess during his campaigns in Gaul, saw an opportunity to use his army and popularity to outmaneuver Pompey. In 49 BCE, the final blow came. Caesar, refusing to disband his army as ordered by the Senate, crossed the Rubicon River, a decisive and illegal act that led to civil war. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he uttered the famous words, "The die is cast." This declaration signaled that there was no turning back. The Republic was about to be plunged into a period of civil war. Caesar's civil war and dictatorship. What followed was a series of military campaigns between Caesar's forces and those loyal to Pompey. The war culminated in a decisive battle at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's forces overwhelmingly defeated Pompey's. After Pompey fled to Egypt, he was assassinated by the orders of the Egyptian king, Ptolemy XIII. With Pompey dead, Caesar was left without any serious rivals. He returned to Rome and in 46 BCE was appointed dictator for life, a position that granted him absolute control over the Republic. This was the moment when Caesar effectively ended the Roman Republic. He was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. During his rule, Caesar enacted a series of reforms designed to stabilize Rome and address its internal problems. He redistributed land to the poor, reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, which would be used in the Western world for centuries, and reduced the power of the Senate. But while many of these reforms were popular with the people, Caesar's consolidation of power alarmed the Senate and the Roman elite. Caesar's actions pushed the Senate to a breaking point. Many senators feared that Caesar was becoming too powerful, and that his rule threatened the very foundations of the Republic. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, who were once loyal to Caesar, assassinated him in the Senate. Caesar's murder was meant to restore the power of the Senate, but in reality it marked the final death knell for the Roman Republic, the aftermath of Caesar's death. Caesar's assassination threw Rome into chaos. While the Senate hoped to restore its control, it quickly became clear that the Republic could not return to its former state. Caesar's assassination triggered another round of civil wars as competing factions vied for control of the Republic. Caesar's death left a power vacuum that would be filled by two of his most loyal supporters, Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man and military commander, and Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and heir. Antony and Octavian initially formed a political alliance, along with Caesar's former ally Lepidus, to fight against the forces of the Senate. This alliance became known as the Second Triumvirate. In 42 BCE, the forces of the Second Triumvirate faced off against the armies of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. The battle ended in a decisive victory for Antony and Octavian, and both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. With their enemies defeated, Antony and Octavian now controlled the Republic, but the real struggle for power was just beginning. The final collapse of the Republic. The years following Caesar's death saw increasing tensions between Antony and Octavian. The two men had once been allies, but now they were rivals. Their struggle for control of Rome culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle fought between Octavian's fleet and Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces. Octavian's victory at Actium marked the end of Antony's power. Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide, leaving Octavian as the sole ruler of Rome. Octavian returned to Rome as a hero, hailed as the savior of the Republic. But rather than restoring the Republic, Octavian took the title of Augustus, meaning the revered one, and became the first emperor of Rome. His reign marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus and the consolidation of power. When Augustus returned to Rome in 29 BCE after his victory at Actium, he had already won the support of the Roman people and military. However, he understood that true power would not come from military victories alone. It would come from political legitimacy. To avoid the mistakes of his predecessors, Augustus worked to present himself not as a monarch, but as the protector and restorer of the Roman Republic. Augustus cleverly used his political skill to create a facade of restored republican values. He was granted the title of princeps, meaning first citizen, rather than the more traditional title of king or dictator. In this way, Augustus portrayed himself as the leader of a constitutional monarchy, where power remained in the hands of the Senate and the people, even though in reality, Augustus held supreme power. Augustus undertook a massive program of reforms, military, administrative, and social. One of his most significant reforms was the creation of a standing professional army, paid directly by the state, which solidified his control over the military. He also created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit tasked with protecting the emperor. Through these reforms, Augustus ensured that he had the loyalty of Rome's military forces, which would be essential for maintaining his rule and the stability of the empire. His reign ushered in a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The Pax Romana. The Pax Romana was a period of relative peace that lasted from 27 BCE to 180 CE. During this time, the Roman Empire experienced economic prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural flourishing. Augustus's reforms laid the foundation for this golden age, and his successors, known as the Julio-Claudian emperors, would continue his work. Under Augustus, the Roman Empire expanded its borders, consolidating power in the Mediterranean region and beyond. The empire reached its territorial height under Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast, and from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. Roman cities flourished during this period. The empire built aqueducts, roads, and public baths, and the Roman Forum became the political and cultural heart of the empire. The arts and literature also thrived. Writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace produced works that would become central to Western literary tradition, while architects and engineers built some of the most impressive structures in history, including the Colosseum and the Pantheon. While Augustus and his successors maintained a facade of republican governance, the reality was that the emperor was the ultimate authority in the empire. The Senate's role became largely ceremonial, and imperial power was passed from one emperor to the next, either through family succession or through force, as the power of the military remained paramount. The Julio-Claudian emperors following Augustus's death in 14 CE, his stepson Tiberius became the second emperor of Rome. While Tiberius was a competent military leader, his reign was marred by paranoia and distrust. He withdrew from public life for much of his rule, leaving much of the day-to-day governance of the empire to his advisors and the military. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, however, would be most famously remembered for its dramatic and often violent rulers. Caligula, Augustus's great-grandson, ascended the throne in 37 CE. His reign was short, but notorious for its cruelty, extravagance, and erratic behavior. Caligula's actions, such as declaring himself a living god and allegedly planning to make his horse a consul, led to his assassination in 41 CE. Following Caligula's assassination, Claudius, his uncle, became emperor. Claudius was an unlikely ruler, often dismissed by the elite for his disabilities, but he proved to be an effective administrator. He expanded the empire into Britain and undertook a series of significant public works. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors was Nero, who ruled from 54 CE to 68 CE. Nero's reign began with promises of good governance, but it soon descended into scandal and excess. Nero is often remembered for his tyranny, including the infamous persecution of Christians and his role in the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. In the end, Nero's reign ended in disaster. Faced with rebellion and a loss of support, he committed suicide in 68 CE, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, and the height of imperial Rome. After Nero's death, the empire was thrown into a brief period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Ultimately, the military general Vespasian emerged victorious, founding the Flavian dynasty in 69 CE. Vespasian's reign brought stability to the empire, and his son Titus would oversee the completion of the Colosseum, one of Rome's most iconic structures. Under the Flavians, Rome continued to thrive. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, expanded the empire's borders and solidified its infrastructure. Titus famously completed the conquest of Jerusalem, while Domitian expanded the empire's defenses in the north and carried out a series of building projects. However, Domitian's reign was marred by paranoia and autocratic rule, much like the emperors before him. His assassination in 96 CE marked the end of the Flavian dynasty and ushered in the era of the Five Good Emperors. The reign of the Five Good Emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, marked one of the most prosperous and stable periods in Roman history, often referred to as the Pax Romana, the crisis of the 3rd century. After the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire faced a period of instability known as the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE. During this time, the empire was plagued by military, political, and economic troubles. The once stable borders of the empire were constantly under threat from barbarian invasions, while the internal political structure collapsed under the strain of ineffective rulers. The empire was divided by civil war as numerous military leaders, known as barracks emperors, vied for the throne. This weakened the empire's ability to defend its borders, and the Germanic tribes and other groups along the frontiers began to press in on the Roman provinces. The economic situation also worsened, with rampant inflation, a decline in trade, and a loss of agricultural productivity. The empire was divided into three main regions: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the remaining Roman Empire in the center. While the empire eventually stabilized under the reforms of Emperor Diocletian, the damage was already done, and Rome's former dominance was increasingly under threat. Diocletian and the division of the empire. In 284 CE, Emperor Diocletian came to power during this chaotic period. A skilled military leader, Diocletian realized that the empire's vast size and complexity had become too much for a single ruler to govern effectively. He introduced a series of reforms aimed at stabilizing the empire, including dividing it into two parts: the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, each with its own emperor. Diocletian ruled the eastern half from the city of Nicomedia, modern-day Turkey, while Maximian ruled the west from Milan. Diocletian also established the Tetrarchy, a system of rule by 4 emperors, with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors known as Caesars. This system was intended to ensure smoother succession and prevent civil war. But as with many Roman reforms, it was a temporary solution. Despite Diocletian's efforts, the empire remained divided and weakened. In 313 CE, Constantine the Great, a former Caesar, rose to power after defeating his rivals. Constantine not only reunited the empire, but also took steps that would forever change the course of Roman history. Constantine and the Christianization of Rome. Constantine was one of the most influential emperors in Roman history. In 312 CE, before a crucial battle for the throne, Constantine famously saw a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky, along with the words, "In this sign you will conquer." After winning the battle, Constantine converted to Christianity, becoming the first Roman emperor to do so. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity and allowed it to be practiced openly across the empire. Constantine's conversion and subsequent support of Christianity transformed the Roman Empire. Under his rule, Christianity went from being a persecuted faith to the dominant religion of the empire. Constantine himself was baptized shortly before his death in 337 CE, and his reign marked the beginning of a new era for the Roman world. In 330 CE, Constantine founded a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which he named Constantinople. The city would later become the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a direct continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, and it would serve as the center of Christian civilization for over 1,000 years. The decline of the Western Roman Empire. Despite Constantine's reforms, the Western Roman Empire continued to face immense challenges. The division of the empire into 2 parts had made it harder to defend against external threats. The western provinces were repeatedly attacked by barbarian tribes such as the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric the Red, famously sacked Rome, a shocking event that symbolized the decline of the Western Roman Empire. Though Rome had been sacked before, it had never fallen so deeply. But even in the face of these invasions, the empire's internal strife and lack of effective leadership made it nearly impossible to restore order. The final blow came in 476 CE, when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer. With this event, the Western Roman Empire officially came to an end. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE is often seen as the end of ancient Rome, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, culture, and tradition. It wasn't until 1453 CE, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, that the last remnants of the Roman Empire were finally extinguished. Finally, the legacy of Rome. While the Roman Empire may have fallen, its legacy lived on in numerous ways. Roman law, language, architecture, and culture influenced the development of Western civilization. The Roman Republic's system of governance served as a model for modern democratic systems, and Roman engineering, from roads and aqueducts to monumental architecture, remained a symbol of Rome's ingenuity and lasting impact. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church preserved much of Roman culture, particularly in the form of Roman law and Christianity, which became the dominant faith in Europe. The ideas of Roman citizenship and the legal concept of innocent until proven guilty still form the foundation of many modern legal systems. And so, though the empire that ruled the Mediterranean world for over 1,000 years may have fallen, the spirit of Rome continued to inspire, shape, and influence generations to come. As we conclude our journey through the rise and fall of the mighty Roman Empire, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of history. The empire that once spanned continents, built monumental structures, and revolutionized governance has long since fallen. But even in its decline, Rome left behind a legacy that would endure through the ages. Rome's influence can still be seen today in the architecture that defines Western cities, the legal systems that underpin modern societies, and the language that continues to shape many of the world's tongues. The ideals of Roman citizenship, law, and democracy are woven into the fabric of modern civilization. Even though the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, the Byzantine Empire continued the Roman tradition for another 1,000 years. The Eastern Roman Empire would endure until 1453 CE, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. But the influence of Roman thought, law, and culture persisted through the ages, ensuring that the legacy of Rome would never truly disappear. Through the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church preserved Roman learning, culture, and law. The Renaissance saw a revival of Roman ideals and a rediscovery of its art and literature. Even today, the remnants of Rome, its laws, its language, its engineering marvels, remain integral to the development of Western civilization. The Roman Empire may have been a product of its time, shaped by the political and military realities of the ancient world. But the Roman people, their ideas, and their innovations transcended the empire itself. Rome was not just an empire, it was an idea, one of unity, power, and civilization. It is a legacy that lives on, a thread woven into the tapestry of history. Outro. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete history of Rome. From its legendary founding to its meteoric rise and eventual fall, we have seen how the Roman Empire shaped the world in profound ways. Its story is a reminder that even the greatest civilizations face challenges, yet their legacies can live on for centuries. As we reflect on the lessons of Rome, we are reminded that every empire, every civilization, is built on the foundation of the ideas, values, and innovations of those who came before. The rise and fall of Rome is a story of ambition, triumph, struggle, and enduring influence. And even as the empire faded into history, the Eternal City remains a beacon of human achievement. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the history of Rome, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss out on future videos. Share this story with others, and let's continue to explore the great civilizations that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, Rome may have fallen, but its spirit endures.
Imagine an empire so vast, it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. An empire built on speed, fear, and unrivaled military genius. From the deserts of Mongolia to the heart of China, the Mongol Empire's rise and fall shaped the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. But how did a tribe of nomadic warriors evolve into the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen? And why, despite its dominance, did it eventually crumble into fragmented khanates? Today, we'll uncover the entire history of the Mongol Empire and explore its lasting legacy. Stick around, because what you're about to discover will change the way you think about empire building and world history. The rise of the Mongol Empire, origins and early history. The Mongol Empire, one of the largest empires in history, spanned vast territories from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. But how did this mighty empire rise from the steppes of Mongolia? To understand the full scope of the Mongol Empire's history, we must first explore its origins, the events leading up to its formation, and the early days of its explosive growth. The land and people. The Mongols originated from the vast, harsh steppes of Central Asia, a region with a long history of nomadic cultures. This was a land where survival depended on the ability to endure extreme weather, rough terrain, and fierce competitors. The Mongol people, known for their skills in horsemanship, archery, and warfare, were deeply rooted in a nomadic lifestyle, relying on their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle for sustenance. These steppes were a crossroads of cultures, where the ancient Silk Road connected the East and the West. The Mongols were not isolated, but were part of a complex network of traders, invaders, and conquerors who had lived in the region for centuries. The Mongols had frequent interactions with neighboring tribes, including the Khitan, the Jurchen, and the Uyghur, each leaving their mark on Mongol society and culture. The tribal structure. Mongol society was organized into various tribes, each led by a chief or khan. These tribes were often in competition, constantly fighting over resources, land, and power. At the beginning of the 12th century, the Mongol tribes were fragmented and lacked unity. The region was home to constant warfare, with various tribes vying for dominance over the others. However, this would soon change with the rise of a figure who would forever alter the course of history: the birth of Temujin. The pivotal figure in the rise of the Mongol Empire was a man named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan. Temujin was born around 1162 to a tribal leader named Yasuji, a member of the Borjigin clan, one of the many Mongol clans that inhabited the steppes. The circumstances surrounding Temujin's early life were harsh, filled with struggle and adversity. At the age of 9, Temujin's father was poisoned by a rival tribe, leaving the young boy and his family to fend for themselves in the unforgiving steppe. The family was abandoned by their clan, and Temujin was forced to grow up in poverty. He learned to survive through sheer determination and the support of his mother, who played an instrumental role in his early life. Despite his difficult circumstances, Temujin showed remarkable leadership qualities from a young age. His ability to inspire loyalty, forge alliances, and unite different tribes would later become key elements of his success. However, his rise was not without opposition. In his early years, he faced betrayal, rivalry, and even enslavement at the hands of enemy tribes. But through a combination of cunning, strength, and a growing following, Temujin began to carve a path towards power. The rise of Temujin. Temujin's journey towards becoming the leader of the Mongols began when he reunited with his blood brother, Jamukha, who had been a close companion during their youth. Together, they began to unite the fragmented Mongol tribes. However, their relationship soured when they disagreed on how to rule the Mongol people. Temujin advocated for a meritocratic system, where the most capable men would rise to positions of power, regardless of their tribal background. Jamukha, on the other hand, believed in the traditional aristocratic system, where positions were determined by birth and lineage. This ideological clash led to a bitter conflict between the two, culminating in the Battle of Dalan Bal's Hut in 1187. Despite the defeat, Temujin's reputation as a leader continued to grow. After this conflict, Temujin began to consolidate his power, making strategic alliances with various tribes. He understood that in order to unite the Mongol people, he needed to eliminate the traditional tribal rivalries that had plagued the region for centuries. Over the years, he expanded his influence, gaining the loyalty of key military leaders, including Kublai, a powerful general, and Subutai, a brilliant strategist. These alliances were crucial for Temujin as they formed the backbone of his future military campaigns. The title of Genghis Khan. By 1206, after years of warfare, diplomacy, and alliance building, Temujin had successfully united the Mongol tribes under his leadership. At a grand assembly called the Kurultai, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This title was not only a recognition of his military victories, but also symbolized his dominance over the Mongol people and his vision of creating an empire that would stretch across the known world. The title of Genghis Khan marked the beginning of an unprecedented era in history. Under his leadership, the Mongol Empire would grow at a staggering rate, conquering vast territories and changing the course of world history. But Genghis Khan was not just a warlord. He was also a visionary who sought to create a cohesive and well-organized empire. His military strategies, organizational methods, and legal reforms would lay the foundation for one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. Early military campaigns. With the title of Genghis Khan, the Mongols were no longer a collection of disparate tribes. They were now a unified force. Genghis Khan quickly turned his attention to the neighboring kingdoms and empires, focusing on the Jin dynasty in China, which had long been a source of tension for the Mongols. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched his first major military campaign against the Jin dynasty. The Mongols, known for their cavalry and archery skills, used highly effective tactics to overcome the Jin forces. Genghis Khan's army was fast, mobile, and incredibly disciplined, giving them a decisive advantage over the slower, more rigid Jin forces. The Mongols utilized psychological warfare, often leaving a trail of destruction in their wake to instill fear in their enemies. They also employed innovative siege tactics, using catapults and other advanced weapons to break down fortifications. The Mongols' ability to adapt to different battle conditions and employ a range of military strategies was one of the key factors behind their success. By 1215, the Mongols had captured the Jin capital of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, a major victory that showcased the military prowess of Genghis Khan's army. This was just the beginning of his conquests, and soon the Mongols would turn their attention to other parts of Asia and beyond. The Mongol conquests expanding the empire. With the title of Genghis Khan and the unification of the Mongol tribes, Temujin, now the undisputed leader, began to turn his ambitions outward. The Mongol Empire was no longer a collection of fragmented tribes. It was a military powerhouse ready to take on the world. Genghis Khan's vision was clear. He sought to create an empire that stretched across Asia, eventually reaching Europe and the Middle East. This was just the beginning of a series of unprecedented military campaigns that would reshape the world forever. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. One of Genghis Khan's first major targets was the Khwarezmian Empire, located in present-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Kazakhstan. The Khwarezmian Empire was a prosperous and powerful state, but it made a critical mistake. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan traveling through the empire was attacked and its members killed by the Khwarezmian officials. In retaliation, Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic mission to the Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, requesting that the perpetrators be punished and that trade be allowed to continue. The Shah, either dismissing the Mongol leader or underestimating his power, responded by executing the Mongol envoys and killing the remaining members of the caravan. This act of treachery would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Genghis Khan, known for his commitment to vengeance, was furious. He swore to annihilate the Khwarezmian Empire for the insult. In 1219, Genghis Khan mobilized one of the most formidable military campaigns in history. His army, which had grown to a force of several 100,000 men, marched westward across the Central Asian steppes, targeting the Khwarezmian cities one by one. Genghis Khan's military strategies were unrivaled, and his use of siege warfare, psychological tactics, and speed gave the Mongols a significant advantage over the Khwarezmian forces. The Mongols' swift and brutal campaign destroyed the cities of Bokhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, all of which fell under Mongol control. In a particularly gruesome episode, after the fall of Samarkand, Genghis Khan's forces captured the city's defenders, and in retaliation for their defiance, massacred the entire population. In the wake of these victories, the Khwarezmian Empire was left in ruins. The Shah, realizing that he could not defeat Genghis Khan's forces, fled to the west, eventually dying in exile. This brutal campaign had far-reaching consequences. It sent a powerful message to the world. Genghis Khan would not tolerate insults, and his empire would expand relentlessly until all who opposed him were destroyed. The invasion of the Jin dynasty. Meanwhile, in the east, Genghis Khan had already turned his attention to the Jin dynasty, a state that controlled much of northern China. The Jin had long been a rival of the Mongols, and their defeat of the Mongol tribes earlier in history had fueled Genghis Khan's desire for revenge. The Mongols had launched several campaigns against the Jin before Genghis Khan's rise, but none had been successful. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched a full-scale invasion of the Jin dynasty, starting with their northern territories. The Mongol military's mobility and their ability to strike swiftly were crucial advantages in this war. The Mongols, skilled in cavalry tactics, would often conduct lightning raids that left the Jin forces scrambling to respond. Over the course of several years, Genghis Khan's army systematically chipped away at the Jin defenses, capturing fortresses and overwhelming their forces in key battles. By 1215, the Mongols had breached the walls of Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, the Jin capital. This victory was a crucial turning point in the Mongol expansion. The Jin dynasty's power was effectively broken, and the Mongols controlled large portions of northern China. The conquest of the Jin dynasty also highlighted Genghis Khan's ability to adapt his military strategies. While the Mongols were known for their mobile cavalry, they were also quick to adopt siege tactics and new technologies, including Chinese gunpowder weapons. This flexibility allowed them to defeat enemies with more advanced technologies, and it demonstrated Genghis Khan's commitment to learning from the cultures he encountered. the Battle of the Indus and the Western Expansion. After consolidating his control over northern China, Genghis Khan turned his attention westward. The Mongol Empire, now firmly established in Central Asia, began to look beyond the borders of China. In 1219, Genghis Khan launched a campaign into the Khwarezmian Empire, but he also sought to expand into the Middle East and beyond. The Mongols faced a difficult challenge in their campaigns against the powerful Islamic empires in the region. However, they were undeterred. Genghis Khan's forces moved swiftly, crossing the vast deserts and mountainous terrain of Central Asia. One of the most significant campaigns of this period was the Mongol invasion of the Western Khwarezmian territories, including Persia, modern-day Iran, and parts of the Caucasus. The Mongols' campaign in the region was characterized by their relentless advance. In 1220, they began the siege of the city of Nishapur, a major Persian city. The city fell after a prolonged siege, and the Mongols massacred its population. This brutal tactic became a hallmark of Genghis Khan's empire. Cities that resisted Mongol conquest often faced total destruction. The Mongols did not stop there. Their armies pressed on into the heart of Persia, and within just a few years, Genghis Khan's empire stretched from China in the east to the Persian Gulf in the west. The success of these campaigns demonstrated the Mongol military's exceptional discipline and the ability of their commanders to execute complex strategies across a wide range of terrains. At the height of Genghis Khan's conquests, the Mongol Empire was an unprecedented force. It stretched across the steppes of Central Asia, the deserts of Persia, and into China. But Genghis Khan's ambitions were far from over. As his empire expanded, the Mongols encountered new cultures, new technologies, and new enemies. With each victory, Genghis Khan solidified his legacy as one of the greatest military leaders in history. The legacy of the conquests. The Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan were not just about military dominance. They were also about creating a lasting empire that would shape the future of Eurasia. Genghis Khan's conquests disrupted established political structures, but they also facilitated cultural exchange and trade across vast regions. The Mongol Empire helped to revive the Silk Road, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. Genghis Khan's empire promoted trade, and the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, allowed for relative stability across the vast territories under Mongol control. This era of peace helped to foster cultural and intellectual exchange, bringing new ideas to both the East and the West. Despite the violence and destruction associated with Genghis Khan's conquests, his empire laid the groundwork for a new global order. The Mongol Empire became a bridge between different cultures and civilizations, and its impact would continue to be felt long after Genghis Khan's death. The legacy of Genghis Khan governance, laws, and the Mongol way. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was not only a military juggernaut but also a sophisticated, highly organized state. While Genghis Khan is often remembered for his brutal conquests, it is equally important to recognize his contributions to governance, law, and the foundation of an empire that would endure for generations. A vision of unity and administration. One of the key elements of Genghis Khan's success was his ability to govern an empire that stretched across diverse cultures, religions, and peoples. Unlike many conquerors who ruled through fear and oppression alone, Genghis Khan sought to create a stable, unified empire. He realized that to maintain control over such vast territories, he would need to establish a strong administrative system that could integrate different cultures and systems of governance. To achieve this, Genghis Khan appointed trusted generals and officials, often promoting individuals based on merit rather than aristocratic lineage. This was revolutionary at the time, as many societies still operated on rigid, hereditary power structures. Genghis Khan's meritocratic approach allowed talented individuals to rise to positions of influence, regardless of their background. His closest advisors and commanders, including the likes of Kublai, Jeeb, and Subutai, were not necessarily from noble families, but they were highly skilled and loyal, which Genghis Khan valued above all else. To manage such a sprawling empire, Genghis Khan divided his territories into several administrative units, each overseen by a governor or military leader. These leaders were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring the loyalty of the population. The Mongols, known for their skill in communication, also established an efficient postal system that allowed for fast and secure transmission of messages across vast distances, ensuring that the central authority remained informed about developments in far-flung provinces. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code. One of Genghis Khan's most significant contributions to the stability of the empire was the creation of the Yasa, a legal code that helped to regulate Mongol society and ensure order within the empire. The Yasa was a set of laws and decrees designed to govern every aspect of life within the Mongol Empire, from military discipline to social behavior. Although many of the details of the Yasa have been lost to history, it is known that it included laws against theft, bribery, and adultery, as well as regulations governing the behavior of soldiers and the treatment of prisoners. The Yasa was known for its strictness, but it also emphasized loyalty, discipline, and respect for the ruler. It was an essential tool for maintaining the cohesion of the Mongol Empire, especially given the diverse ethnic groups and cultures that Genghis Khan had conquered. The law applied equally to all subjects of the empire, regardless of their background, and it helped to create a sense of unity and order amidst the vast and heterogeneous territories. Another important aspect of the Yasa was its religious tolerance. Genghis Khan believed in the importance of maintaining peaceful relations between the different religious communities within his empire. Under his rule, Mongols practiced a policy of religious freedom, allowing the people they conquered to practice their faiths without fear of persecution. This policy was relatively rare in the medieval world, where religious intolerance and conflict were widespread. Diplomacy and the Mongol approach to empire building. Genghis Khan's approach to governance was not purely military. He also relied heavily on diplomacy and strategic alliances to expand and maintain the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were known for their diplomatic flexibility, often seeking alliances with neighboring states to secure their borders or gain an advantage in future campaigns. One of the most notable examples of Mongol diplomacy was their relationship with the Khitan people. The Khitans, a group of nomadic tribes from the steppes, had been a traditional enemy of the Mongols. However, in the early 13th century, Genghis Khan sought to ally with the Khitans against the growing threat of the Jin dynasty. By forging this alliance, Genghis Khan was able to leverage the Khitans' knowledge of warfare and their network of trade routes to strengthen his position. Additionally, Genghis Khan's diplomatic efforts extended beyond his immediate neighbors. He also sought to build connections with the Persian and Islamic world, and in some cases, the Mongols would use diplomacy as a tool to prevent conflict. They often offered terms of peace to rulers who would submit to Mongol rule, promising them autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tribute. The Mongol military, tactics, and innovations. The success of Genghis Khan's empire was built largely on the strength of his military. The Mongol army was renowned for its discipline, mobility, and innovative tactics. Much of the Mongols' success in battle was due to their exceptional cavalry, which made them one of the most effective military forces of the medieval period. The Mongols were expert horsemen, able to ride for long distances while carrying heavy loads of supplies and weapons. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, which was smaller and more powerful than the longbow used by European armies at the time. The Mongols could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed, a skill that made them almost unstoppable on the battlefield. Their ability to shoot from horseback also allowed them to outmaneuver and overwhelm enemies who were less mobile. In addition to their cavalry, the Mongols also employed a range of other military innovations. They were among the first to use siege warfare on a large scale, and they adopted Chinese gunpowder weapons, including catapults and bombards, to breach fortified cities. This combination of traditional Mongol tactics and new technological innovations allowed them to overcome even the most well-defended cities. One of the key aspects of Mongol military strategy was their use of psychological warfare. The Mongols often employed fear as a tool, spreading terror among their enemies. They would frequently leave entire populations of cities they had captured dead or enslaved, sending a clear message to other cities that resistance would not be tolerated. In many cases, this fear led to cities surrendering without a fight, knowing that the Mongols would show no mercy to those who resisted. Genghis Khan's use of deception was another key element of his military success. Mongol armies often employed feigned retreats, luring enemy forces into traps where they would be surrounded and destroyed. The Mongols also used intelligence networks to gather information on their enemies, enabling them to make informed decisions and anticipate enemy movements. The death of Genghis Khan. As Genghis Khan's empire continued to expand, his focus began to shift. In 1227, while preparing for an invasion of the Western Xia Kingdom in China, Genghis Khan fell ill. His condition worsened, and he died in August of that year, at the age of 65. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery to this day, with theories ranging from illness to an injury sustained during a fall from his horse. Despite his death, Genghis Khan's empire continued to expand under the leadership of his sons and grandsons. His successors, including his son Ogedei Khan, maintained the momentum of his conquests, ensuring that the Mongol Empire became one of the largest empires in history. Genghis Khan's legacy, however, extends far beyond his military conquests. His vision for a unified, meritocratic empire and his ability to integrate different cultures and religions into his empire shaped the world in ways that are still felt today. The successors of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire after his death. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 marked the end of an era for the Mongol Empire, but it did not signal the collapse of the empire he had built. Instead, Genghis Khan's successors would go on to further expand the Mongol Empire, carrying forward his vision and military prowess. However, the empire was also at a crossroads, and the path forward would be marked by challenges and shifts in leadership that would shape the future of the empire. The transition of power. Upon Genghis Khan's death, his eldest son, Jebe, did not immediately assume the title of Khan. Instead, leadership passed to his third son, Ogedei Khan, who was elected by a grand council known as a Kurultai in 1229. This was a defining moment in the Mongol succession. Unlike many other empires where succession was often determined by birthright or force, the Mongols respected the Kurultai as a democratic institution that allowed the greatest leader to rise to power, regardless of lineage. Ogedei Khan was Genghis Khan's chosen successor, but he faced the challenge of continuing the expansion of the Mongol Empire while maintaining the internal unity his father had established. While Genghis Khan had been a force of nature, Ogedei's leadership would be defined by his ability to govern and direct the empire's vast forces. His reign lasted from 1229 to 1241, a period marked by both internal consolidation and territorial expansion. Ogedei Khan's expansion of the empire. Ogedei Khan's leadership was characterized by an aggressive continuation of the Mongol conquest. He began by consolidating the territories already under Mongol control and by pursuing further conquests in the west, including the successful campaigns into Eastern Europe and in the east, where Mongol forces pushed further into the Song dynasty in China. Under Ogedei, the Mongols launched a series of devastating campaigns across Eastern Europe. One of the most significant was the invasion of the Kingdom of Hungary in 1241. The Mongols, led by the brilliant General Subutai, decisively defeated Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohi, inflicting heavy casualties. This victory sent shockwaves across Europe, and it is said that it was the Mongol invasion that led to widespread fear and confusion throughout the region. However, before the Mongols could fully consolidate their gains in Europe, Ogedei's death in 1241 halted further campaigns in the west. Ogedei also continued his father's policy of religious tolerance and his vision of maintaining a multicultural empire. Under his rule, the Mongols extended their influence over vast regions of Eurasia, including Russia, the Caucasus, and Persia. As a result, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. The fragmentation of the empire. Although Ogedei's reign brought territorial expansion and success, his death in 1241 had profound consequences for the Mongol Empire. The decision to break the empire into distinct administrative regions, called khanates, contributed to its eventual fragmentation. The empire had grown so vast that it became difficult to govern as a unified entity, and the expansionist ambitions of different branches of Genghis Khan's family created tensions. The Mongol Empire was divided into several khanates, each ruled by one of Genghis Khan's descendants. These khanates were the Yuan dynasty in China. This khanate, which eventually became the Yuan dynasty, was ruled by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. The Golden Horde, a powerful khanate that controlled much of Russia, led by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. The Ilkhanate, this khanate controlled Persia and parts of the Middle East, led by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis Khan. The Chagatai Khanate, this region covered much of Central Asia, led by Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. While these khanates were all nominally under the rule of Genghis Khan's descendants, they often operated independently. This decentralization eventually led to a lack of cohesion and rivalries between the khanates, weakening the unity of the empire and contributing to its eventual fragmentation. Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. The most significant successor to Genghis Khan was his grandson, Kublai Khan, who would go on to establish the Yuan dynasty in China. Kublai Khan's reign was one of the most transformative periods in the history of the Mongol Empire. His achievements, while rooted in his grandfather's legacy, would also reflect his own unique vision. Kublai Khan's most notable achievement was the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. By 1279, after a prolonged and difficult war, Kublai succeeded in unifying China under Mongol rule. This marked the first time that China had been fully unified under a non-native ruler. Kublai's conquest of China was marked by his adoption of Chinese customs and governance systems. He recognized the importance of bureaucracy and civil administration, and he implemented many of the systems that would help to sustain the Yuan dynasty. Kublai's reign, however, was not without challenges. He faced internal resistance from the native Chinese population, who were hostile to Mongol rule. Additionally, Kublai struggled to maintain control over the vast territory his family had conquered, and the Mongol Empire as a whole faced difficulties due to the division of power between the khanates. Despite these challenges, Kublai Khan's rule is regarded as one of the high points of Mongol history. His leadership contributed to the spread of Mongol influence in China, as well as in the broader East Asian region. The Yuan dynasty, while short-lived, played an important role in integrating China into the larger Mongol Empire, fostering trade, and promoting cultural exchanges that would shape East Asia for centuries. Batu Khan and the Golden Horde. Another significant branch of the Mongol family was Batu Khan, who ruled the Golden Horde in the western part of the Mongol Empire. Batu's territory included much of modern-day Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. Under Batu's leadership, the Golden Horde expanded further into the heart of Russia, defeating the Kievan Rus and establishing the dominance of the Mongols over much of the region. The Golden Horde's influence over Russia would continue for centuries, even as the Mongols began to lose control over the rest of their empire. Batu Khan's descendants ruled the region until the 15th century, leaving a lasting legacy in Russian history. The Mongol occupation of Russia also had profound cultural and political consequences, contributing to the centralization of power in Moscow and the eventual rise of the Russian Empire. Hulagu Khan and the Ilkhanate. Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, founded the Ilkhanate, a khanate that controlled Persia and much of the Middle East. Hulagu's most famous military campaign was the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, when he captured Baghdad and put an end to one of the most powerful and prosperous Islamic empires of the medieval period. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age and had long-lasting repercussions for the Middle East. However, the Ilkhanate was plagued by internal conflict, as different factions within the Mongol leadership struggled for control. Despite these challenges, the Ilkhanate survived for several generations, influencing the development of Persian culture and politics. The decline of the Mongol Empire. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was in decline. The Khanates, once united under the leadership of Genghis Khan, were increasingly isolated from each other. The once cohesive military force was now divided, and each Khanate faced challenges of governance, rebellion, and external threats. Despite the early successes of his descendants, the Mongol Empire was unable to maintain its vast holdings for long. However, the Mongols left an indelible mark on the world. The Mongol conquests had opened up vast trade routes, leading to an era of cultural exchange between East and West. The Mongols had facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies across Eurasia, leaving a legacy that would influence the course of world history long after the empire itself had fragmented. The fall of the Mongol Empire: causes and consequences. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire had reached its zenith. However, the once unified and unstoppable force that Genghis Khan had created was beginning to unravel. The empire, divided into several khanates, was experiencing internal conflicts, external pressures, and the natural consequences of such an expansive and diverse empire. The decline of the Mongol Empire would ultimately pave the way for the rise of new powers across Eurasia, but the impact of the Mongols would echo through history long after their empire had fragmented. The internal division of the khanates. One of the key factors contributing to the decline of the Mongol Empire was the fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates. After the death of Genghis Khan, the vast territory he had conquered was divided among his descendants, each ruling over their own region. While this system worked for a time, the lack of centralized authority soon began to create fissures within the Mongol Empire. The Mongol khanates, such as the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, became increasingly isolated from one another. Although they shared a common Mongol heritage and nominal loyalty to the Great Khan, each Khanate was more or less independent, often pursuing its own interests. This decentralization weakened the unity that had been so crucial to the empire's success. Furthermore, the rivalry between different branches of Genghis Khan's family exacerbated the divisions. Successors often clashed over leadership and territory, leading to civil wars and conflicts that weakened the empire. The rivalry between Kublai Khan of the Yuan dynasty and other Mongol rulers, for example, caused significant friction and strife, ultimately undermining the unity of the empire. Economic strains and overextension. Another critical factor in the decline of the Mongol Empire was the empire's overextension. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Mediterranean, covering vast swathes of territory. While this geographical expanse provided the Mongols with access to numerous trade routes and resources, it also proved to be a double-edged sword. The Mongol Empire's enormous size created logistical challenges that strained its resources. The empire's military, which had once been a highly mobile and formidable force, struggled to maintain control over distant provinces. The vast distance between the different khanates made communication and coordination difficult, and rebellions in far-off regions were harder to suppress. Additionally, the Mongols had to manage a wide range of diverse cultures, religions, and societies, each with its own traditions and economic systems. Although the Mongol rulers, particularly Kublai Khan, were known for their religious tolerance, the diversity within the empire often led to friction and unrest. As the Mongol Empire tried to maintain its hold on such a vast and culturally diverse region, it faced economic strains that were difficult to overcome. The Black Death and its impact. One of the most significant events that contributed to the collapse of the Mongol Empire was the spread of the Black Death, which devastated the world in the mid-14th century. The plague, which likely originated in China or Central Asia, spread rapidly through the Silk Road, which had been re-established under the Mongols. The Mongols, who had facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas across Eurasia, inadvertently played a role in the spread of the disease. The Black Death decimated the population of Europe, the Middle East, and large parts of Asia. In China, the death toll was catastrophic, with estimates suggesting that up to 30% of the population perished. The pandemic disrupted trade routes, caused widespread economic collapse, and led to the breakdown of political systems. The Mongol Empire, already weakened by internal divisions, was hit particularly hard. The death of so many people undermined the empire's ability to maintain its vast administrative apparatus and military strength. In the Yuan dynasty in China, the Black Death contributed to the weakening of Mongol rule. By the 1360s, rebellion and discontent with Mongol rule were widespread, and the Yuan dynasty eventually fell in 1368, replaced by the Ming dynasty, which was composed of native Chinese rulers. The Ilkhanate in Persia also succumbed to internal instability and the effects of the plague, eventually fragmenting and collapsing into smaller regional states. The decline of the Golden Horde. In Russia, the Golden Horde saw its power erode over time. While the Mongols had ruled over Russia for centuries, their influence began to wane in the 14th and 15th centuries. The disintegration of the Golden Horde was accelerated by internal struggles for power among the Mongol rulers, as well as pressure from the rising Muscovite state centered around Moscow. As Moscow grew in power, it began to challenge the Mongols. Ivan III of Moscow, also known as Ivan the Great, famously refused to pay tribute to the Golden Horde in the 1480s, marking the beginning of the end for Mongol rule in Russia. By the late 15th century, the Mongols had been driven from Russia, and the Grand Duchy of Moscow emerged as the dominant power in the region. The Ilkhanate and the fall of Persia. In the Ilkhanate, the Mongols had ruled Persia for several decades, but the state suffered from internal conflict and external threats. The Ilkhanate experienced a series of succession crises and power struggles, weakening the central authority. The Mongol rulers of Persia were also heavily influenced by the local population, and many adopted Persian customs, culture, and Islam. Over time, this integration of Mongols into Persian society created a hybrid ruling class, which further eroded the unity of the Ilkhanate. By the 14th century, the Ilkhanate had fragmented, and smaller regional powers began to assert their independence. Persia eventually fell under the control of the Timurid Empire in the late 14th century, under the leadership of Timur Tamerlane, who was a descendant of Genghis Khan through his father's side. The end of the Mongol Empire. By the mid-14th century, the once mighty Mongol Empire had fragmented into several smaller, weakened states. While these states continued to exert influence in their respective regions, the unity and power of the Mongol Empire had dissipated. The final blow to the Mongol Empire came as a result of internal divisions, economic strain, the Black Death, and the rise of new powers. In China, the Ming dynasty established itself as a new, dominant force after overthrowing the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368. In Russia, the Mongols were gradually pushed out by the Muscovites, culminating in the eventual collapse of the Golden Horde. In Persia, the Ilkhanate disintegrated, and regional powers took control. Despite the empire's collapse, the Mongol legacy endured. The Mongols had left an indelible mark on the world, shaping the course of history in ways that would echo for centuries. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, had facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia, leaving behind a legacy of interconnectedness that would eventually lead to the flourishing of the Renaissance in Europe and the rise of global trade. The Mongols, despite their empire's collapse, had irrevocably altered the course of world history, establishing a vast network of trade routes and contributing to the spread of knowledge, technology, and culture. The world that emerged after the fall of the Mongol Empire was forever shaped by their conquests and innovations. The legacy of the Mongol Empire, a world transformed. While the Mongol Empire fractured into distinct khanates and ultimately collapsed, its legacy lived on, leaving a profound and lasting impact on global history. The influence of the Mongols reached across continents, shaping not only the political landscape but also cultural exchanges, trade, technology, and even the course of subsequent empires and nations. The Mongols, through their conquests and administration, shaped the future of Eurasia in ways that would echo for centuries. The Pax Mongolica, a period of unprecedented connectivity. One of the most enduring legacies of the Mongol Empire was the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. While the Mongols were known for their brutality in battle, they also established a period of relative peace and stability across much of Eurasia, particularly between the 13th and 14th centuries. This peace was a crucial factor in facilitating cultural and economic exchanges across the vast expanse of the empire. Under the Mongols, the Silk Road, the ancient network of trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, flourished like never before. The Mongol Empire secured and protected these routes, ensuring safe passage for merchants, diplomats, and travelers. This allowed for the exchange of not only goods like silk, spices, and precious metals, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The spread of paper, gunpowder, and printing from China to the West, and the transmission of Persian and Arabic knowledge to Europe, were pivotal in shaping the course of world history. The Mongol Empire also facilitated the movement of people across continents. Traders, scholars and artisans traveled along the Silk Road, fostering cross-cultural interactions that had a profound influence on the arts, sciences, and philosophy in both the East and the West. The introduction of Chinese porcelain, Persian rugs, and Islamic architecture to Europe and other regions left a lasting imprint on local cultures. The Mongols and the spread of technology. The Mongols played a significant role in the transmission of technology across the empire. The most notable example is the spread of gunpowder. Although gunpowder was invented in China, it was the Mongols who were instrumental in bringing this technology to the West. As Mongol armies encountered various cultures and empires, they adopted and improved upon technologies, particularly in the field of warfare. The Mongols also helped to spread the use of the compass and printing. The compass, originally used by Chinese sailors, became crucial for navigation across the seas, especially as European explorers began their voyages. The Mongols' role in bringing these technologies to the West would be crucial for the age of exploration, which would transform the world in the following centuries. Another technological legacy was in military tactics. The Mongols introduced innovations such as feigned retreats and hit-and-run tactics in warfare. These tactics, which emphasized mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare, would be adopted by later military powers. Mongol siege tactics, which included the use of catapults and gunpowder-based weapons, influenced the development of military strategies in both the Islamic world and Europe. The cultural exchange and the Mongol influence on art. The cultural impact of the Mongol Empire is perhaps most evident in the arts. The Mongols were patrons of the arts and supported the creation of vibrant and unique artistic expressions that blended elements from various cultures under their rule. The fusion of Mongol, Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian styles led to a unique and distinctive form of art, particularly in the realms of illustration, architecture, and textiles. In China, the Mongols adopted Chinese artistic traditions, incorporating them into their own imperial projects. The Yuan dynasty saw the creation of beautiful Chinese-style paintings, ceramics, and poetry. The Mongols also played a significant role in the development of Mongol-style art, which was influenced by Persian and Central Asian designs. This synthesis of different artistic traditions produced a rich cultural heritage that would continue to influence art and architecture in both China and the Middle East. In Persia, the Mongols contributed to the development of Islamic art by incorporating elements of Mongol military culture, such as the use of bright colors and intricate patterns, into Persian manuscripts and miniatures. These influences can still be seen in Persian carpets, ceramics, and textiles to this day. The rise of new powers and the legacy of Mongol governance. The Mongol Empire, despite its collapse, left a blueprint for governance that influenced the development of new empires in its wake. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged in the 14th century, adopted many of the administrative structures and military tactics of the Mongols, blending them with Islamic traditions. The Ottomans, like the Mongols, ruled over vast and diverse territories, using military prowess and effective governance to maintain control. In Russia, the Mongol influence was particularly significant. The Mongols' rule over Russia, known as the Tatar yoke, lasted for more than 2 centuries, and its impact on Russian culture, politics, and military organization was profound. The Mongols contributed to the centralization of power in Russia, setting the stage for the rise of the Russian Empire under the Tsars. The Muscovite state, in particular, borrowed heavily from Mongol models of governance, including the use of tribute systems and military organization. In China, the Mongols' establishment of the Yuan dynasty left an indelible mark on Chinese governance and culture. While the Yuan dynasty was eventually replaced by the Ming dynasty, many of the Mongol administrative practices, such as the use of a centralized bureaucracy and a system of taxation, were retained by the Ming rulers. The Mongols also introduced a more cosmopolitan worldview, encouraging the integration of foreign cultures into Chinese society. The decline of Mongol influence and the legacy in modern times. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fractured into smaller states, and their influence began to wane. However, the legacy of the Mongols remains embedded in the fabric of global history. The Mongols were instrumental in reshaping the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia, and their empire served as a bridge between the East and West, facilitating trade, cultural exchange, and technological innovation. The Mongols left a legacy of military innovation, governance, and cultural syncretism that influenced the development of subsequent empires and states. Their contributions to the spread of ideas, technologies, and goods would have far-reaching consequences, especially in the realms of exploration and global trade. The rise of the Ming Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire can all be traced, in part, to the foundations laid by the Mongol Empire. In modern times, the legacy of the Mongols is still visible in the regions they once ruled. From the Great Wall of China to the cities of Samarkand and Baghdad, Mongol influence remains a part of the historical and cultural landscape of Eurasia. The Mongol Empire remains one of the most remarkable and impactful empires in history, and its story continues to captivate historians, scholars, and enthusiasts around the world. As the Mongol Empire crumbled, it left behind a legacy that would continue to shape the world for centuries. The empire's impact on trade, technology, and culture still echoes through history, influencing the rise of new powers and laying the groundwork for the modern world. While the Mongols may no longer rule the vast land they once controlled, their mark on the history of Eurasia and the entire globe remains undeniable. From military tactics to cultural exchange, their story is far from over. So, whether you're a history buff or just curious about one of the most extraordinary empires ever, the Mongol Empire's journey proves that even the greatest empires eventually fade, but their legacy lives on forever. What do you think of when you hear the name Ottoman Empire? Grand palaces? Powerful sultans? The shimmering crossroads of East and West? For centuries, this empire ruled vast lands, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts of Arabia, and from the Balkans to the heart of Africa. But what's the untold story behind its rise, its cultural achievements, and ultimately its fall? And how did the once mighty Ottoman Empire give birth to the modern nation-state of Turkey? In this documentary, we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover the empire's secrets, the transformations it endured, and the legacy that still shapes the world today. From the legendary reign of Suleiman the Magnificent to the visionary reforms of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, this is the untold story of the Ottoman Empire like you've never heard before. This is the journey from empire to republic. This is the untold story of the Ottoman Empire. The rise of the Ottoman Empire. The story of the Ottoman Empire begins long before its grand expansion into Europe, Asia, and Africa. It begins in the late 13th century, in a time when the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had already begun to fragment, leaving a vacuum of power in Anatolia. A small Turkic tribe, the Kei, led by Osman I, would soon rise to fill this gap and lay the foundations for what would become one of the most powerful and influential empires in world history. The early years, Osman I and the birth of an empire. In the late 1200s, the Byzantine Empire, once a proud and mighty civilization, was crumbling under the weight of external invasions and internal disunity. The Mongols had swept through the region, ravaging much of the Middle East, and now the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, holding on to little more than the city of Constantinople. The weakening of the Byzantine Empire left the Anatolian heartland open for conquest by various Turkic groups, most notably the Seljuk Turks and the growing Ottoman force. It is in this chaotic period that Osman I emerges. According to most historical accounts, Osman I was born around 1258 in the town of Sagat, located in present-day Turkey. He inherited leadership of the Kei tribe from his father, Ertugrul, and was initially a small-time chieftain with relatively modest ambitions. However, Osman, like many other leaders of his time, was not content with merely defending his people. He dreamed of a much larger, more influential future. Osman's early victories were crucial in cementing his status as a leader of not just his tribe but the growing Turkic forces in the region. His first major success came in 1299 when he declared independence from the Seljuk Sultanate and laid the foundation for what would eventually become the Ottoman Empire. Osman's military campaigns were particularly focused on weakening the Byzantine hold on Anatolia, making the collapse of the Byzantine Empire one of the key contributing factors to the rise of the Ottomans. What made Osman's leadership so effective was not just his military prowess, but also his ability to form alliances with local Christian communities, as well as his strategic marriages. By aligning himself with the local Byzantine nobles, Osman was able to build a network of supporters within the Byzantine territory, further expanding his influence. It was a mix of military conquest and diplomacy that would define the early years of the Ottoman Empire. The legacy of Osman I. Osman I ruled until his death in 1326, and in his lifetime, he had laid the groundwork for a powerful empire. His son, Orhan, would succeed him and continue his father's legacy of expansion, but it was Osman's strategic vision and pioneering spirit that would remain the defining features of the early Ottoman Empire. The name Ottoman itself comes from Osman. In Turkish, the empire is known as Osmanlı İmparatorluğu, meaning Empire of Osman, a tribute to its founder's role in creating a state that would last for over 600 years. But the story of the rise of the Ottomans is not just about military victories. It's also about the way the early Ottomans managed to integrate the various cultures, religions, and ethnicities of the lands they conquered. Unlike many of the empires that came before them, the Ottomans had a unique approach to governance. They did not impose a single, rigid system on their subjects. Instead, they allowed a degree of autonomy to local rulers, especially in the early years, as long as they pledged allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan. This tolerance toward diversity was crucial in the formation of the Ottoman Empire, allowing it to expand into a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that spanned continents. The flexibility and pragmatism in the way the Ottomans managed their empire, especially in the early years, would later be key to their success in maintaining control over vast and diverse territories. The conquest of Constantinople. By the time of Osman's descendants, the Ottomans were poised for their greatest achievement, the conquest of Constantinople. The city had long been the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the crossroads between East and West, and it had withstood countless sieges over the centuries. But by the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had all but collapsed, and the Ottomans were ready to seize the opportunity. It was under the rule of Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, that the Ottomans would take the final step toward becoming a world empire. Mehmed ascended to the throne in 1444, and after a series of military campaigns in the Balkans and Anatolia, he turned his attention to the Byzantine capital. Constantinople was an ancient and legendary city, and its conquest would forever change the course of history. Mehmed's siege of Constantinople in 1453 was a defining moment in both Ottoman and world history. The city had long been surrounded by massive walls, and the Ottomans would need to overcome these formidable defenses in order to succeed. To do so, Mehmed employed cutting-edge military technology, most famously using massive cannons that could smash through the walls. The siege lasted for several months, and the defenders, led by the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaeologus, fought valiantly to protect their city. Despite their best efforts, the Byzantines were no match for the relentless Ottoman forces. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire ceased to exist, and the Ottomans had gained control of one of the most important cities in the world. This was a monumental turning point in world history. For the Ottomans, the conquest of Constantinople was more than just a military victory. It marked the moment when they transformed from a regional power into a global empire. The city, which would now be known as Istanbul, would become the heart of the Ottoman Empire and serve as its capital for centuries to come. The conquest of Constantinople also had far-reaching implications for Europe and the rest of the world. The fall of the city marked the end of Christian rule in the East, and it effectively closed off one of the most important trade routes between Europe and Asia. In the years that followed, European powers would seek alternative routes to the East, leading to the Age of Exploration and the eventual discovery of the Americas. The rise of the Ottoman naval power. By the end of the 15th century, the Ottomans had firmly established themselves as a dominant power in both Europe and Asia. However, one of the key factors in the Ottoman Empire's ability to expand and maintain its power was its naval strength. The Ottomans had long been adept at managing trade routes, but under the reign of Mehmed II's successor, Sultan Selim I, the Ottomans would begin to build a powerful navy capable of projecting power far beyond their borders. Selim I's military campaigns in the early 16th century were focused primarily on the Middle East. He defeated the Mamluks of Egypt in 1517, incorporating Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina into the Ottoman Empire. But it was during the reign of Selim's son, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, that the Ottoman navy would truly come into its own. Suleiman, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, is often remembered for his military conquests and legal reforms, but his naval campaigns were equally significant. Under his command, the Ottomans extended their naval power into the Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond. Suleiman's fleet became one of the most formidable in the world, and it helped to solidify Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean for centuries. The Ottomans' control over key maritime routes allowed them to control much of the trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia, further strengthening their position as a global power. The Ottoman navy would go on to play a crucial role in their ability to maintain a vast and sprawling empire that stretched from the Balkans to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire. As we continue the story of the Ottoman Empire, we shift focus to the era after the conquest of Constantinople, a time when the Ottomans would reach the peak of their power. This period, known as the Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire, spanned the 16th and early 17th centuries, under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors. By this time, the Ottoman Empire had grown from a small tribal state into a sprawling empire that stretched across 3 continents, encompassing the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman I, often called Suleiman the Magnificent, became the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1520, following the death of his father, Selim I. His reign marked the height of the Ottoman Empire's political, military, and cultural power. Suleiman was not only a brilliant military leader but also a skilled administrator, a patron of the arts, and a lawgiver who left a lasting impact on Ottoman governance. Suleiman's early military campaigns further expanded the empire's borders, with notable victories in Europe and the Middle East. He turned his attention to Hungary, successfully conquering large parts of it, including the critical city of Buda, which would remain under Ottoman control for over 150 years. But perhaps his most famous military campaign was against the Safavid Empire in Persia, where his forces captured key territories in Iraq, marking the Ottomans as the dominant power in the region. In addition to military prowess, Suleiman sought to solidify his empire by modernizing its legal system. He instituted sweeping reforms to Ottoman law, organizing the legal structure into a more coherent and accessible system. These reforms earned him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver, in the Ottoman world. Suleiman's legal code addressed a wide range of issues, from civil disputes to criminal law, and laid the foundations for how the empire would be governed for centuries. While Suleiman was busy expanding the empire, his rule also coincided with the blossoming of Ottoman culture. Istanbul became a thriving center of art, literature, and architecture, with numerous buildings and landmarks erected during this period that are still admired today. The Süleymanî Mosque, one of the most iconic structures in Istanbul, was completed under his reign and remains a symbol of the empire's grandeur. However, Suleiman's empire was not solely built on military success and legal reform. His court also became a cultural hub, attracting scholars, poets, and artisans from across the Islamic world and beyond. Under his patronage, the Ottoman Empire became a cultural bridge between Europe and Asia, with influences from both continents contributing to the empire's unique style in art, architecture, and literature. The expansion into the Mediterranean and North Africa. Suleiman's reign also saw the Ottomans become the undisputed naval power of the Mediterranean. While the Ottomans had already begun building a formidable navy under his predecessors, it was under Suleiman that the empire truly asserted its dominance over the seas. His naval campaigns were spearheaded by the famous admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, who had defected from the Spanish side and joined the Ottomans in 1512. Barbarossa's leadership transformed the Ottoman fleet into a force to be reckoned with. The Ottomans secured key naval victories, including the Battle of Preveza in 1538, which solidified Ottoman control over the Mediterranean and kept European maritime powers at bay. Under Suleiman and Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy expanded into the Western Mediterranean, securing control of vital trade routes and increasing Ottoman influence over North Africa, where the empire established control over key cities such as Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis. The Ottomans' dominance of the Mediterranean allowed them to not only control trade but also spread their cultural and political influence across the region. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman fleet was one of the most formidable in the world, able to challenge the naval power of Spain and Venice, two of Europe's leading maritime states. This expansion was not limited to military conquests. The Ottomans continued to build upon the empire's diverse society, ensuring that different cultures, religions, and traditions thrived under their rule. The Ottomans employed a system known as the millet system, which allowed religious communities within the empire, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim alike, to govern themselves according to their own laws. This system of autonomy was a hallmark of Ottoman rule, promoting coexistence among a multitude of groups that lived within the empire's borders. The safeguarding of the Ottoman economy. By the mid-1500s, the Ottoman Empire had established itself as a key player on the global stage, but it was not only military victories and cultural achievements that ensured its continued prosperity. The Ottomans were also adept at controlling trade routes, particularly those between Europe and Asia. Their position allowed them to dominate the flow of goods between the East and West, controlling important land and sea routes. Under Suleiman, the empire maintained a strong central bureaucracy that ensured the smooth functioning of trade. The Ottomans also made significant investments in infrastructure, building roads, bridges, and caravanserais, inns for travelers and traders, which facilitated the movement of goods and people across their vast territories. This infrastructure supported not just the economy but also the cultural exchange between different regions of the empire. The Ottomans benefited greatly from their control of the Silk Road and spice trade, becoming middlemen in a vast international network that linked Asia to Europe. Trade cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo flourished as bustling hubs of commerce, attracting traders from across the globe. These economic advantages contributed significantly to the empire's wealth, allowing it to fund both military campaigns and cultural endeavors. However, by the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire began to face economic challenges. While trade continued to flow through Ottoman territories, European powers started to seek alternative trade routes that bypassed the Ottomans. The rise of Atlantic trade and the opening of sea routes to the Americas and Asia slowly shifted the global economic balance, reducing the empire's position as the central hub of global commerce. The challenges of managing a vast empire. Despite its prosperity, the Ottoman Empire faced growing challenges in the 17th century. The empire's size, spanning 3 continents and countless cultures, became increasingly difficult to govern effectively. The decentralized nature of the Ottoman system, in which local rulers and military leaders held considerable power, began to create fractures in the empire's unity. Additionally, the influx of wealth from trade and conquests led to internal corruption and inefficiency. By the end of the 16th century, the empire's military, once its greatest strength, began to experience difficulties. The Janissaries, the elite military corps that had been so vital to the Ottoman success, began to grow complacent, increasingly resistant to reforms and innovations. The Ottomans had long relied on their military to expand their empire, but as the Janissaries became less effective, the Ottomans found it harder to maintain their dominance over their territories. Meanwhile, the empire's political structure also began to show signs of strain. Succession disputes, palace intrigues, and the weakening of central authority contributed to a growing sense of instability. While the empire was still vast and powerful, the seeds of decline had been sown. Yet, the golden age of the Ottomans would continue for several more decades, and it was during this time that the empire would see one of its greatest rulers, Suleiman the Magnificent, whose legacy would endure long after his death. The decline and transformation of the Ottoman Empire. While the Ottoman Empire's golden age flourished under Suleiman and his immediate successors, the following centuries would reveal a more complex and challenging future. The empire's decline was neither sudden nor uniform. Rather, it was a slow unraveling, an erosion from within, fueled by internal strife, external pressures, and the changing geopolitical landscape. The rise of the sick man of Europe. By the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached its territorial peak, but it was beginning to face critical internal challenges. The empire's vast size, combined with its complex multi-ethnic, multi-religious structure, made it increasingly difficult to govern effectively. The power of local provincial governors began to rise at the expense of the central authority, weakening the Sultan's control over the empire. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the Ottoman military, began to lose their discipline and effectiveness. They had grown resistant to reforms and increasingly involved themselves in political life, undermining the very system that had made the empire powerful. At the same time, economic changes were taking place that reduced the Ottoman Empire's position as a central player in global trade. The discovery of new sea routes by European explorers to Africa, Asia, and the Americas shifted the flow of wealth away from the land-based trade routes that had once enriched the Ottomans. Moreover, the rise of powerful European nation-states, such as Britain, France, and Russia, further eroded the Ottomans' influence. These nations began to chip away at the empire's territories, each seeking to expand their own influence at the expense of the Ottomans. Russia, in particular, became a serious rival to the Ottomans, engaging in a series of wars over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries that further drained Ottoman resources. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had earned the nickname the Sick Man of Europe. While still holding large territories, its inability to keep up with the technological, military, and economic advancements of Europe signaled that the empire was in a period of significant decline. The once great empire, which had been at the center of global power, was now a shell of its former self, plagued by corruption, internal divisions, and the relentless pressures from external forces. The age of reforms, the Tanzimat era. Recognizing the looming threat of collapse, the Ottoman leadership attempted a series of reforms throughout the 19th century. The Tanzimat reforms, which began in the 1830s under Sultan Mahmud II and continued under his successors, were aimed at modernizing the empire in order to maintain its relevance. These reforms included the establishment of new legal codes, a reorganization of the military, and the introduction of new schools and infrastructure projects. Sultan Mahmud II played a pivotal role in weakening the power of the Janissaries. In 1826, after the Janissaries staged a rebellion, Mahmud took decisive action by having thousands of them executed and disbanding the corps. This marked a significant turning point in Ottoman military and political history. Mahmud's reforms extended beyond the military. He also sought to centralize power and implement a more modernized system of governance. However, these changes were met with resistance from both conservative factions and local elites, leading to unrest and discontent. After Mahmud's death in 1839, the Tanzimat reforms continued under his successors, notably Sultan Abdulmecid I, who oversaw the issuance of the Hadi Sharif of Gulhane in 1839. This decree promised a new era of reform and modernization, guaranteeing equality for all subjects of the empire, regardless of religion or ethnicity. The Tanzimat era sought to reconcile the empire's traditional Islamic structure with the demands of modernization, incorporating European-inspired legal and administrative reforms. These reforms also sought to improve the economy, streamline tax collection, and reduce the corruption that had plagued the empire for centuries. However, despite these ambitious reforms, the Ottoman Empire remained a patchwork of contradictory forces. While urban elites in Istanbul were often enthusiastic about Western-style reforms, many rural and provincial regions clung to traditional systems of governance. The tensions between modernity and tradition would continue to shape the empire's history throughout the 19th century. The Balkans and nationalism, the loss of territory. One of the most significant challenges the Ottoman Empire faced in the 19th century was the rise of nationalism in the Balkans. Long under Ottoman rule, the various ethnic groups in the Balkans began to demand independence and self-determination. The decline of Ottoman power provided the perfect opportunity for nationalist movements to take root and gain momentum. Serbia was the first to break away from Ottoman rule in the early 19th century. By 1830, after a series of uprisings and military confrontations, the Ottomans were forced to grant Serbia autonomy. Other Balkan states soon followed suit, with Greece achieving independence after the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830. The Ottomans struggled to maintain control over their European territories, facing both internal revolts and external pressures from European powers that saw the weakening of the Ottomans as an opportunity to expand their influence in the region. The Russian Empire, in particular, began to play an increasing role in the Balkans, positioning itself as the protector of Slavic Christians under Ottoman rule. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was a direct result of these tensions, with the Ottoman Empire, backed by Britain and France, fighting Russia to maintain its territorial integrity. While the Ottomans managed to repel the Russian invasion, the war weakened the empire further, and European powers began to carve out spheres of influence within Ottoman lands. The loss of territory in the Balkans was a major blow to Ottoman prestige. By the late 19th century, many of the empire's former European holdings had become independent nations. The rising tide of nationalism in the Balkans would continue to contribute to the empire's disintegration throughout the 20th century, culminating in the outbreak of World War I. The decline of the Ottoman military. As the 19th century wore on, the Ottoman military increasingly fell behind Europe in terms of modernization and capability. While European armies were advancing in tactics, technology, and organization, the Ottoman military retained many of its traditional methods. The failure to modernize the military effectively contributed to a series of defeats against both internal and external enemies. The Ottoman Navy, which had once been a formidable force under Suleiman the Magnificent, was also in decline. European powers had developed more advanced naval fleets, while the Ottomans struggled to maintain their naval strength. This technological gap would prove decisive in the loss of key battles and territories, as the Ottomans found it harder to project power beyond their borders. At the same time, the Ottomans began to rely more on European advisors and military experts to modernize their forces. While this brought some improvements, it also highlighted the empire's increasing dependence on foreign powers, which further eroded its sovereignty and independence. The Ottoman military, once the driving force behind the empire's expansion, now stood as a symbol of its weakening position in the world. The Young Turks and the final struggles. By the turn of the 20th century, a new generation of Ottoman reformers, known as the Young Turks, emerged, advocating for constitutional reforms and a more democratic system of government. The Young Turks overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1909, establishing a constitutional monarchy and modernizing the empire's political system. However, their efforts to preserve the empire were undermined by the continuing pressures of nationalism, military defeats, and the rise of European imperialism. The Ottoman Empire's inability to adapt to the rapidly changing world left it vulnerable to collapse. World War I would mark the final chapter in the Ottoman saga, as the empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, only to face defeat and disintegration. The fall of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of modern Turkey. The First World War marked the final chapter in the long and storied history of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been a dominant power, but by the early 20th century, the empire had become an anachronism, unable to compete with the rapid modernization of Europe and the rise of new national movements within its own borders. The war that would bring about the empire's collapse was also the war that would give rise to the modern nation-state of Turkey, an entirely new entity forged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans in World War I, a last stand. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline for over a century. Despite attempts at reform, it was still deeply mired in political corruption, social unrest, and military inefficiency. The empire's territorial holdings had been significantly reduced, especially in Europe, and its once powerful military was a shadow of its former self. The Ottomans entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers, which included Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping that victory would help reverse their declining fortunes. However, the Ottomans were ill-prepared for the challenges of modern warfare, and their involvement in the conflict would only accelerate their decline. The Ottoman military faced a series of devastating defeats. In the Middle East, British forces, led by General T. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, orchestrated a successful campaign that saw the capture of Ottoman-controlled territories, including Egypt, Palestine, and much of the Arabian Peninsula. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, the Ottomans were defeated by Russian forces, further eroding their position in the region. The most disastrous defeat, however, came at the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915. The Allies, primarily British and French forces, launched a failed naval and land campaign aimed at securing control of the Dardanelles and opening a new front against the Central Powers. Despite the Allies' overwhelming superiority, the Ottoman forces, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who would later become the founder of the Republic of Turkey, managed to inflict a humiliating defeat on the invaders, securing their control over the strategic Gallipoli Peninsula. This victory was a moment of pride for the Ottoman Empire, but would ultimately prove to be one of the empire's final successes before its demise. By 1918, the war had taken its toll on the Ottomans. The Central Powers were defeated, and the empire's fate was sealed. The signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918, officially ended Ottoman participation in the war. The terms of the armistice were harsh. Ottoman forces were ordered to disarm, and Allied occupation of key Ottoman territories began. The partitioning of the empire. The aftermath of World War I saw the Ottoman Empire effectively disintegrating. The victors of the war, particularly the British and the French, were determined to divide the Ottoman lands among themselves through a series of secret agreements, most notably the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. This agreement carved up the Middle East into spheres of influence, with the British gaining control of Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, while the French took control of Syria and Lebanon. The partitioning of the Ottoman Empire sowed the seeds of conflict and instability in the region that continues to have repercussions to this day. In addition to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Ottoman Empire was subjected to the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, a punitive peace treaty that sought to dismantle the empire entirely. The treaty proposed the complete disintegration of the Ottoman state, with large portions of its territory either being ceded to Allied powers or becoming independent nations. The most significant territorial loss was Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, which was to be divided among Greece, Armenia, and various Kurdish regions, while the city of Istanbul was to be placed under international control. The treaty was an affront to Turkish national pride, and its terms were seen as humiliating by many. However, the Treaty of Sèvres would never be fully implemented. A resistance movement was already brewing in Anatolia, led by the ambitious and charismatic Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. The discontent caused by the Treaty of Sèvres would ignite the Turkish War of Independence, a struggle that would ultimately lead to the birth of the modern Turkish Republic. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and the birth of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal was a military officer who had risen to prominence during World War I, particularly for his role in the Gallipoli campaign. His leadership and vision would prove crucial in the Ottoman Empire's transition into the modern era. In 1919, following the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres, Mustafa Kemal began organizing resistance to the terms of the treaty and the foreign occupation of Anatolia. His efforts were largely based in the city of Sivas, where he began to rally the Turkish people against the occupying powers and the Ottoman government, which he saw as weak and incapable of defending Turkish sovereignty. The movement was initially political, with the goal of rejecting the Treaty of Sèvres and restoring Turkish independence. Kemal's political and military acumen, combined with his ability to unite a fragmented and demoralized country, allowed him to form a nationalist army that would eventually defeat both the Greek and Armenian forces occupying parts of Anatolia. This was the beginning of the Turkish War of Independence, 1919 to 1923, a campaign that saw Kemal's forces steadily push back foreign invaders and restore control over Anatolian territory. The war culminated in the establishment of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey in 1920, a new government that would serve as the foundation for the Republic of Turkey. In 1923, after a series of military victories, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished, and the Republic of Turkey was declared on October 29, 1923, with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as its first president. Ataturk's vision for the new republic was one of modernization, secularism, and national unity. His reforms included the introduction of a new civil code, the adoption of the Latin alphabet, and the establishment of secularism as a fundamental principle of the Turkish state. Ataturk's leadership transformed Turkey from a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire into a unified, modern nation-state. His reforms were not without controversy, but his legacy as the founder of modern Turkey is undeniable. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of the Ottoman Empire marked the end of one of the most influential empires in world history, but its legacy continues to shape the modern world. The territorial divisions created by the empire, particularly in the Middle East, continue to influence the political and cultural landscape of the region today. Furthermore, the Ottoman Empire's cultural contributions, including its architectural achievements, art, literature, and culinary traditions, remain an integral part of the collective heritage of many countries. The empire's unique system of governance, which combined Islamic principles with a flexible, decentralized approach to ruling over diverse peoples, is still studied and admired for its pragmatism. The Ottoman Empire, though gone, continues to be remembered as a historical giant, one that spanned centuries, bridged continents, and influenced the course of global history in ways that are still felt today. The rise of modern Turkey, Ataturk's vision and legacy. The birth of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, was nothing short of a revolutionary moment. The Ottoman Empire, a vast multicultural and multi-religious entity, had been replaced by a new, secular, and modern nation-state. Ataturk's vision was clear: to transform the remnants of the Ottoman Empire into a nation that embraced modernity, nationalism, and secularism. His reforms not only reshaped Turkey's political landscape but also impacted its society, economy, and cultural identity. Secularism and the reformation of religion. One of Ataturk's most significant and controversial reforms was the introduction of secularism into the Turkish state. Under the Ottoman Empire, Islam was the central institution around which the state was organized. The Sultan was both the political and religious leader, and the religious hierarchy had significant influence over the empire's laws and social structures. However, Ataturk recognized that in order for Turkey to modernize and become part of the international community, it needed to distance itself from theocratic governance and establish a secular republic. Ataturk's secular vision meant that religion would no longer play an official role in the government. In 1924, he abolished the caliphate, which had been a symbol of the unity of the Muslim world under Ottoman rule. This marked a decisive break from the centuries-old tradition of Ottoman political Islam. Ataturk also introduced sweeping reforms to separate religion from the state and public life. Religious schools were closed, and religious influence in the public sphere was significantly reduced. The presidency, for example, would not have any religious role, and the state would support only secular institutions. Religious practices also underwent reforms. Ataturk encouraged the use of the Turkish language in religious services, replacing the Arabic language prayers in mosques with Turkish ones. He sought to modernize Islam in Turkey, promoting a version that was compatible with the scientific and educational advances of the time. While many of these changes were welcomed by secular elites, they also sparked resistance among conservative segments of Turkish society, particularly those who viewed Islam as an integral part of their identity. Ataturk's reforms in religion were aimed not just at reducing the power of the clergy, but also at fostering a sense of Turkish nationalism that transcended religious divisions. The secularization of the state created a sense of unity among the Turkish people, regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. It was a critical step in forging a national identity that could withstand the pressures of modernity and the influence of foreign powers. Language and education reform, a national identity. Ataturk's desire to create a unified, modern Turkish state also led to one of the most ambitious cultural reforms of the 20th century, the Turkish language reform. The Ottoman Turkish language, which was the official language of the empire, was a complex mixture of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, making it difficult for the majority of the population to understand. Ataturk believed that simplifying and modernizing the Turkish language was essential for nation-building and for the empowerment of ordinary Turks. In 1928, Ataturk's government introduced the Latin alphabet to replace the Arabic script. This change was not merely a shift in writing style. It symbolized a break from the Ottoman past and an embrace of Western modernization. The new alphabet made the language more accessible, and it allowed for greater literacy rates across Turkey. Ataturk also launched a major effort to eliminate foreign words from the Turkish language and replace them with Turkish equivalents. This language reform was part of a broader effort to create a distinctive Turkish cultural identity that was both modern and rooted in the nation's history. Education was central to Ataturk's vision. In 1924, he implemented a new education system that replaced the religious schools of the Ottoman period with secular institutions. The new education system focused on science, mathematics, and modern Western knowledge. Ataturk encouraged the establishment of universities, and many of Turkey's current academic institutions were founded during this period. The goal was to create a well-educated and secular population that could contribute to Turkey's modernization. Ataturk also focused on empowering women through education. He believed that the future of Turkey depended on women's participation in all areas of society, including politics, economics, and culture. His reforms allowed women to attend universities, participate in the workforce, and eventually vote. In 1934, Turkey became one of the first countries in the world to grant women full suffrage, marking another landmark achievement in Ataturk's modernization efforts. The economy, from agrarian to industrial. Ataturk's vision for Turkey wasn't limited to cultural and political reforms. He also sought to transform Turkey's economy, which was largely agrarian and underdeveloped, into a modern industrial economy. He believed that a strong economy was the foundation for a powerful nation-state. The Turkish economy in the early years of the Republic was in a precarious state. The empire's collapse had left the country with a weak industrial base and extensive foreign debt. The country's infrastructure had been neglected during the final years of Ottoman rule, and there were few modern industries. Ataturk's solution was to implement a series of state-led economic reforms aimed at creating an industrial base for the country. Ataturk promoted policies of state control over key sectors of the economy. Large state enterprises were established in sectors such as textiles, cement, and steel. These state-run factories and businesses were intended to create jobs, reduce dependence on foreign imports, and modernize Turkey's industrial capabilities. His government also implemented major infrastructure projects, such as the construction of railroads, roads, and dams, which helped integrate the country's various regions and spurred economic growth. Ataturk's economic policies were inspired by European models of state-led development, but they also had a distinctly Turkish flavor. One of his most notable achievements was the creation of the Turkish Industrial Revolution, which laid the foundation for Turkey's industrialization in the decades that followed. While these policies helped stabilize the economy in the short term, they also placed a strain on state finances, and Turkey's reliance on state-led industrialization would eventually give way to more liberal economic policies in the post-Ataturk era. Ataturk's foreign policy, neutrality, and westernization. In addition to his domestic reforms, Ataturk also reshaped Turkey's foreign policy. After the tumultuous years of the Ottoman Empire's decline and the devastation of World War I, Ataturk sought to ensure that Turkey would remain neutral in global conflicts and avoid being drawn into the rivalries of Europe and the Middle East. His foreign policy was centered on the idea of peace at home, peace in the world, advocating for non-interventionism and peaceful diplomacy. Ataturk's foreign policy was guided by pragmatism. He sought to maintain good relations with both Western powers and neighboring countries. At the same time, he worked to ensure that Turkey would not become embroiled in the political and military entanglements that had led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He signed treaties with neighboring countries, including Greece, Armenia, and the Soviet Union, and he sought to modernize Turkey's military without making it a major player in international conflicts. Ataturk's commitment to secularism also extended to foreign relations. He wanted Turkey to be seen as a modern, secular nation-state, distinct from the religious conflicts that had plagued the Ottoman Empire. His emphasis on secularism was one of the reasons that Turkey aligned itself with Western powers during the interwar years, even though the country maintained a degree of independence from Western influence. The legacy of Ataturk. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's leadership was transformative. His sweeping reforms reshaped Turkey into a modern, secular, and unified nation-state, and his legacy is deeply embedded in the identity of the Turkish Republic. Ataturk's vision for Turkey as a secular, democratic, and nationalist state remains the foundation of Turkish political life to this day. His leadership brought Turkey into the 20th century and set it on a path toward modernization and industrialization. Ataturk's reforms also left a deep impact on Turkish society. The country's education system, economy, and legal framework all bear the marks of Ataturk's influence. His vision of secularism, modernity, and national pride has become ingrained in the collective consciousness of the Turkish people. While Ataturk's policies have been subject to criticism and debate, particularly regarding their authoritarian aspects, his legacy remains overwhelmingly positive in Turkey. He is revered as the father of the modern Turkish state, and his image is prominently displayed in government buildings, schools, and public spaces across the country. The principles of Kemalism, his ideological framework, continue to shape Turkish politics, even as Turkey grapples with the challenges of the 21st century. Turkey in the modern era: challenges, successes, and the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. In the decades following Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's death in 1938, Turkey has faced numerous challenges, both domestic and international. Yet, despite the hurdles, the nation has made significant strides in its journey as a modern republic. From a largely agrarian society to an increasingly industrialized nation, Turkey's evolution is a reflection of its early reforms and its ongoing efforts to reconcile the legacy of the Ottoman Empire with the demands of the 21st century. Economic transformation, industrialization, and growth. Under Ataturk, Turkey initiated a wave of state-led industrialization, but the country's true economic transformation came after his death, as successive leaders built on his foundations. Following World War II, Turkey shifted towards a more market-driven economy, opening the doors to private enterprise and foreign investment. This period of economic liberalization saw Turkey's industrial base expand, with manufacturing becoming a critical component of the economy. The 1980s marked a pivotal moment in Turkey's economic history under the leadership of Turgut Özal, who pushed for an export-oriented growth model and sought to integrate Turkey more closely into the global market. Özal's policies led to significant economic growth, and during the 1990s, Turkey began to emerge as one of the most dynamic economies in the region. However, the country also faced periods of instability, including high inflation, financial crises, and political turbulence. In the early 2000s, Turkey's economy continued to grow under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, AKP. The country achieved impressive economic gains, including improved infrastructure, rising foreign investment, and an expanding middle class. Turkey's economy became increasingly integrated with the global market, with a strong export sector and a burgeoning tourism industry. By the 2010s, Turkey had become one of the world's emerging markets, often referred to as a newly industrialized country. However, challenges remained. The country faced increasing political polarization, tensions over the role of Islam in government, and controversies over human rights and freedom of expression. Despite these challenges, Turkey remains a key player in both regional and global politics, balancing its Ottoman past with its aspirations as a modern, democratic nation. Political landscape: secularism versus Islamism. One of the most significant challenges in modern Turkey has been the ongoing tension between secularism and the growing influence of political Islam. Ataturk's secular vision remains a cornerstone of the Turkish Republic, but in recent decades, the balance between secularism and Islamism has been a contentious issue. Under the leadership of the AKP and Erdogan, Turkey saw a significant shift towards a more prominent role for Islam in political life. Erdogan's government has implemented policies that align more closely with Islamic values, such as promoting religious education, increasing the presence of religion in public life, and limiting the powers of secular institutions. His government has also been associated with cracking down on opposition, restricting press freedoms, and curbing the independence of the judiciary, which has sparked criticism both domestically and internationally. While Erdogan and the AKP have found significant support among Turkey's conservative Muslim population, their policies have also alienated secularists, liberals, and pro-Western factions of Turkish society. The tension between secularism and Islamism has resulted in political polarization, with protests and demonstrations becoming increasingly common in response to the government's policies. This tension has often manifested in debates over Turkey's identity, its relationship with the West, and its future direction. In recent years, Erdogan's increasingly authoritarian style of governance has sparked concerns about the erosion of democratic institutions in Turkey. While the country remains a key member of NATO and has pursued EU membership, its political trajectory is now more uncertain than ever. Turkey's struggle to maintain Ataturk's vision of a secular democracy while balancing the desires of a deeply religious population is one of the defining challenges of the modern Turkish state. Foreign policy, a strategic balancing act. Turkey's foreign policy, shaped by its Ottoman legacy, continues to be a balancing act between regional and global powers. Throughout the 20th century, Turkey aligned itself with Western powers, particularly the United States and NATO, while trying to maintain good relations with its neighbors, including Russia and the Middle Eastern states. In recent years, however, Turkey has sought a more independent foreign policy. Under Erdogan, Turkey has pursued a more assertive role in the Middle East, becoming involved in conflicts such as the Syrian civil war and the war against ISIS. At the same time, Turkey has forged closer ties with Russia, particularly in defense cooperation, despite being a NATO member. These shifts have led to questions about Turkey's future role in the Western alliance and its strategic interests in the region. Turkey's relationship with the European Union has also been a source of tension. While Turkey has sought EU membership for decades, progress has stalled due to disagreements over issues such as human rights, democracy, and Turkey's role in the broader European geopolitical landscape. Despite the economic benefits that EU membership could bring, Turkey's foreign policy is increasingly independent, and its alliances are becoming more fluid and complex. In the Middle East, Turkey's relationship with its neighbors remains fraught with tensions, particularly with Greece, Cyprus, and the Kurdish groups in the region. The long-standing issue of Kurdish separatism remains unresolved, and Turkey's military interventions in northern Syria have added another layer of complexity to its foreign policy. Despite this, Turkey remains a critical player in the region, serving as both a bridge between Europe and Asia and as a counterbalance to regional powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Ottoman legacy, a double-edged sword. The Ottoman Empire's legacy continues to have a profound impact on Turkey today, both in terms of its national identity and its role in regional politics. On the one hand, the Ottoman Empire represents a rich cultural and historical heritage that is celebrated by many Turks. The empire's legacy can be seen in Turkey's art, architecture, cuisine, and traditions. Ataturk's decision to draw on Turkey's Ottoman heritage, while modernizing and secularizing the nation, helped to forge a unique national identity that combines elements of both its Ottoman past and its republican future. On the other hand, the Ottoman legacy can also be a source of tension. The decline and eventual collapse of the empire left a fractured region, with lingering conflicts and unresolved territorial disputes that continue to shape Turkey's foreign policy. The imperial past is also associated with the challenges of managing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, a problem that has continued in modern Turkey, particularly with regard to the Kurdish issue. Turkey's Ottoman heritage is particularly relevant when it comes to its relationship with the Middle East. While Ataturk sought to distance the new republic from the imperial past, Turkey's influence in the region remains tied to the historical Ottoman connection. Today, Turkey is often seen as a regional power with a strong military presence and a key player in shaping the future of the Middle East. The Ottoman legacy, then, remains both a source of pride and a reminder of the complexities of Turkey's historical and geopolitical challenges. Conclusion: the enduring influence of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, despite its eventual collapse, left a lasting imprint on the world. Its political, military, cultural, and economic legacies continue to influence the modern Middle East, Europe, and beyond. The birth of the Turkish Republic and its transformation into a modern, secular state marked a new chapter in Turkey's history, but the shadows of the Ottoman past continue to loom large. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's vision for Turkey was one of modernization, secularism, and nationalism, a vision that helped to transform the remnants of the Ottoman Empire into a modern nation-state. However, Turkey's journey in the 21st century has been shaped by ongoing debates over secularism, democracy, and national identity. As Turkey navigates the complexities of its Ottoman heritage and its role in the contemporary world, the legacy of the empire remains both a guiding force and a challenge for the modern Turkish state. The story of the Ottoman Empire is one of triumph, decline, and transformation. An epic tale that shaped the course of history and continues to influence the world today. From the heights of empire to the rise of a republic, Turkey's story is inseparable from the Ottoman legacy. The journey from empire to nation-state, from past to future, remains one of the most fascinating and complex narratives in the annals of history. From the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the birth of modern Turkey, the story of this once mighty empire is far from over. Its legacy continues to resonate across the borders of history, influencing cultures, politics, and global power dynamics. As Turkey navigates the challenges of the 21st century, the echoes of the Ottoman past still shape its present and future. But the story is not just about the empire that was. It's about the nation that rose from its ashes. A new republic, born out of revolution and vision, still grappling with the complex heritage of its Ottoman roots. The Ottoman Empire may have fallen, but its imprint remains eternal. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. If you've been captivated by the untold history of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of modern Turkey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with others. The past may be gone, but it's never too far from the present. Until next time, we invite you to keep exploring the echoes of history. Imagine an empire so vast it spanned from the sands of Egypt to the banks of the Indus River. A civilization that set the foundation for much of the modern world we know today. From the rise of Cyrus the Great to the fall of Persepolis at the hands of Alexander the Great, the Persian Empire was not just an empire, it was a force that shaped history. Welcome to the incredible story of one of the most influential civilizations ever to exist. Today, we dive deep into the entire history of the Persian Empire. This is the story of power, ambition, culture, and legacy. Let's explore how Persia rose, ruled, and ultimately fell, leaving a mark that echoes through time. The rise of the Persian Empire. The history of the Persian Empire is one of the most fascinating stories in the annals of human civilization. It all began in the ancient land of Persia, a region corresponding to modern-day Iran, where the first seeds of an empire that would stretch from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian subcontinent were planted. The rise of the Persian Empire is a tale of ambition, warfare, and visionary leadership. But before we delve into the grand narratives of kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius, we must understand the origins of the people who would go on to dominate much of the known world for centuries. Early civilizations and pre-Persian Persia. To understand the foundations of the Persian Empire, we must first look at the people who inhabited the region long before the empire's formation. The earliest known civilizations in Persia emerged around 3000 BCE with the rise of the Elamites in the southwestern region, near modern-day Kazakhstan. The Elamites were skilled in metallurgy, arts, and writing and played a crucial role in shaping the region's cultural identity. Their city-states, such as Susa, were pivotal in trade and culture, laying the groundwork for future Persian dominance. At the same time, other ancient peoples were also populating the Iranian plateau. Nomadic tribes such as the Medes and various Indo-European peoples began to migrate into the region. These tribes would play a pivotal role in the establishment of the Persian Empire. The Medes, in particular, established a kingdom that stretched across much of modern-day Iran, with their capital at Ekbatana, present-day Hamadan. For centuries, the Medes were one of the dominant forces in the region, but it would be the Persians who would eventually outshine them. The rise of the Persian kingdom. The origins of the Persian people trace back to the ancient Indo-Iranian tribes who arrived on the Iranian plateau around 1500 BCE. These tribes spoke an early form of the Persian language, which would eventually become the official language of the empire. Among these early Persian tribes was the Achaemenid family, whose name would become synonymous with imperial power in the centuries to come. The Persian kingdom began to emerge as a distinct political entity in the 6th century BCE with the ascension of Cyrus the Great. Before he was crowned the ruler of Persia, the region was still dominated by the Medes. The Medes, however, were not a united empire, and their political structure was more fragmented. The Persian kingdom, located to the south of the Medes, had been under the control of various chieftains and petty kings. Yet it was Cyrus who would change everything. Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, was born around 600 BCE. He was a member of the Achaemenid dynasty, and his rise to power was not a sudden event but the result of years of careful political maneuvering. At the time of his birth, the Medes were the dominant force in Persia. However, by the time Cyrus reached adulthood, the Medes had become politically fragmented. Their king, Astyages, ruled a kingdom that stretched from the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia. Yet his rule was unpopular and the seeds of rebellion had already been sown. The fall of the Median Empire. In the early 6th century BCE, Cyrus's father, Cambyses I, ruled the Persian kingdom. Cambyses was not a particularly powerful ruler, but his son, Cyrus, was different. In 550 BCE, Cyrus, having consolidated his power in the Persian kingdom, led a revolt against the Median king, Astyages. The reasons behind the rebellion are not entirely clear, but it appears that Cyrus had the support of many of the Median nobles who were unhappy with Astyages' rule. Additionally, the Persian kingdom was a growing power, and many saw the opportunity to break free from Median dominance. Cyrus's revolt was successful and he managed to overthrow Astyages, capturing the Median capital of Ecbatana. This marked the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire. By defeating the Medes, Cyrus not only gained control over their territory but also secured the backing of a significant portion of the Median population. With his victory, Cyrus laid the foundation for the Persian Empire that would soon stretch from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. After the fall of the Medes, Cyrus's next target was the Lydian kingdom to the west. Lydia, ruled by King Croesus, was one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world. Croesus, however, made a critical error in judgment when he decided to confront Cyrus. After a brief campaign, Cyrus defeated Croesus in 546 BCE and annexed Lydia into the expanding Persian Empire. The fall of Lydia was a pivotal moment in the history of Persia, as it marked the first of many conquests that would expand the empire's territory into Anatolia and beyond. The conquest of Babylon. Following his victory over Lydia, Cyrus turned his attention to the great city of Babylon. Babylon was one of the most influential and prosperous cities in the ancient world, home to the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At the time, Babylon was ruled by King Nabonidus, who was unpopular among his subjects due to his religious practices and distant rule. Babylon had long been a rival to the Medes and Persians, and the Persian king saw an opportunity to expand his territory further. In 539 BCE, Cyrus led his army into Babylon, defeating Nabonidus without much resistance. The conquest of Babylon was a turning point in world history, as it brought much of Mesopotamia under Persian control. Upon entering the city, Cyrus was hailed as a liberator, as he allowed the exiled Jews, who had been captive in Babylon for decades, to return to their homeland. This act of religious tolerance and magnanimity further solidified Cyrus's reputation as a wise and just ruler. The conquest of Babylon also marked the beginning of the Persian Empire's dominance over the ancient Near East. By the time of his death in 530 BCE, Cyrus had established an empire that spanned from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it set the stage for future Persian rulers to expand even further. The expansion and administration of the Persian Empire. After the death of Cyrus the Great in 530 BCE, the Persian Empire was left under the control of his son, Cambyses II. While Cyrus's reign had laid the foundations of an empire that spanned vast territories, it was Cambyses who would continue his father's legacy by further expanding the empire's borders and solidifying Persian dominance over the ancient world. Yet, Cambyses' reign would also reveal the complexities and challenges of managing such a vast and diverse empire. The conquest of Egypt. One of the most significant achievements of Cambyses was his successful campaign against Egypt, which had long been a powerful civilization in the ancient world. The Egyptians had resisted foreign domination for centuries, and their pharaohs had successfully repelled several invasions. However, Cambyses' military prowess and strategic acumen would lead to a pivotal moment in history, the conquest of Egypt. In 525 BCE, Cambyses marched his army into Egypt, defeating the forces of Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. With this victory, Cambyses effectively brought Egypt under Persian control. The conquest of Egypt was not just a military triumph, but also a cultural and political shift, as the Persians imposed their rule over one of the world's oldest and most storied civilizations. Cambyses took the title of pharaoh and integrated Egypt into the Persian Empire, making it a key province. However, his rule over Egypt was marred by cruelty and controversy. Cambyses' decision to kill the sacred bull, the Apis, and his alleged desecration of Egyptian temples alienated the local population. Though he had succeeded in expanding the empire, Cambyses' reign left a legacy of resentment among the Egyptians. Cambyses' rule was also short-lived. In 522 BCE, he died under mysterious circumstances during an expedition in the eastern parts of the empire. His death set off a brief period of turmoil in Persia, as the empire struggled to maintain its unity and stability. The rise of Darius the Great. Following Cambyses' death, a power struggle ensued among the Persian elite. Several claimants to the throne emerged, but it was Darius I, known as Darius the Great, who would ultimately emerge victorious. Darius's ascent to the throne marked a new chapter in the history of the Persian Empire, one characterized by both military brilliance and administrative innovation. Darius's rise to power was not straightforward. He was not a direct descendant of Cyrus the Great, but rather a distant relative, and his claim to the throne was challenged by other contenders. However, Darius proved himself to be a capable and determined leader. In 522 BCE, after a series of strategic maneuvers and military victories, Darius secured the throne and established himself as the king of Persia. Darius's reign would come to define the Persian Empire at its height. One of his first tasks was to consolidate his power and restore stability after the turmoil that followed Cambyses' death. Darius quickly eliminated rivals and suppressed rebellions, ensuring that the empire remained unified. He also took steps to strengthen the Persian state by instituting a series of crucial reforms that would have a lasting impact on the empire's administration. Darius's administrative reforms. One of Darius's most significant contributions was his reform of the empire's administrative structure. The Persian Empire was vast, and managing such a large territory required a sophisticated system of governance. To address this challenge, Darius divided the empire into several provinces, known as satrapies, each governed by a satrap or provincial governor. The satraps were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring the loyalty of their regions to the king. To ensure the effectiveness of this system, Darius implemented a system of royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king, who were sent to monitor the satraps and prevent corruption or rebellion. This hierarchical system of governance allowed Darius to maintain control over the far-flung reaches of his empire, from the eastern lands of India to the western shores of the Aegean Sea. Additionally, Darius standardized the currency of the empire, issuing the gold coin known as the darichos as a means of facilitating trade and commerce. This monetary reform helped stimulate economic growth and trade across the empire, making the Persian Empire one of the most prosperous and interconnected civilizations of its time. Darius also took steps to improve infrastructure. He commissioned the construction of roads, bridges, and canals to improve communication and transportation throughout the empire. The Royal Road, a network of highways stretching from Susa in Persia to Sardis in Anatolia, became a critical artery for the movement of goods, soldiers, and messages. This infrastructure would play a crucial role in the expansion of the empire and its ability to maintain control over such a vast territory. The Greco-Persian Wars begin. While Darius was focused on consolidating his power and strengthening the empire internally, external challenges loomed large. In the West, the Greek city-states were emerging as a growing power, and their influence would soon come into direct conflict with the Persian Empire. The Greeks were organized into independent city-states, and their growing prosperity and military prowess would soon become a thorn in the side of the Persians. The first major confrontation between Persia and the Greek city-states occurred in 490 BCE, when Darius launched a military campaign to subjugate the Greek mainland. The Greeks, however, proved to be formidable adversaries. In the famous Battle of Marathon, the Persian forces were decisively defeated by a much smaller Greek army, marking one of the first significant setbacks for the Persian Empire in its expansion efforts. The defeat at Marathon was a significant blow to Darius's ambitions in Greece, but it did not end his desire for conquest. He began preparing for a second invasion, but before he could launch it, Darius died in 486 BCE, leaving the task of avenging the Persian defeat to his son, Xerxes I. The reign of Xerxes and the Greco-Persian Wars. With the death of Darius I in 486 BCE, the Persian Empire passed into the hands of his son Xerxes I. Xerxes' ascension marked a turning point in the history of the Persian Empire, as he sought to continue his father's ambitions while navigating the challenges posed by internal dissent, the complexity of governing a vast and diverse empire, and the rising threat from Greece. His reign would come to be defined by the dramatic continuation of the Greco-Persian Wars, a series of conflicts that would shape the future of both the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. Xerxes and his preparation for war. Xerxes' rise to the throne was not smooth. While he had a clear claim to the throne as the eldest son of Darius, his rule was challenged by several revolts within the empire. One of the most notable rebellions took place in Egypt, where the Egyptian people had long resented Persian rule. In 484 BCE, shortly after Xerxes took power, the Egyptians rose up against Persian control. Xerxes quickly responded by sending an army to quell the revolt. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and Egypt was brought back under Persian control. But the episode highlighted the difficulty of maintaining authority over such a vast empire. Despite these internal challenges, Xerxes was determined to complete his father's unfinished business, namely, to conquer Greece and exact revenge for the Persian defeat at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. He launched an immense military campaign against the Greeks, gathering an army that, according to ancient sources, may have numbered as many as several 100,000 soldiers, supported by a vast fleet of ships. The Persian forces were poised to crush the Greeks once and for all, but the outcome of this campaign would become one of the most famous conflicts in ancient history, the Battle of Thermopylae and the fall of the Persian Empire's hopes. In 480 BCE, Xerxes led his massive army into Greece, determined to break the Greek city-state's resistance. The Persian advance was met with determined opposition, with the Greeks forming a fragile but unified defense against the Persian juggernaut. The first major confrontation between the two sides occurred at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where a small force of Greek soldiers, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, made a heroic stand against the Persian army. The Persian army vastly outnumbered the Greeks, but the Greeks held their ground in the narrow pass, using the terrain to their advantage and inflicting significant casualties on the Persians. However, the Greeks were ultimately betrayed by a local who revealed a secret mountain path to the Persians, allowing Xerxes to flank the Greek position. Despite their valiant defense, the Greek force was overwhelmed, and King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans famously perished fighting to the last man. While the Battle of Thermopylae ended in defeat for the Greeks, it became a symbol of heroic resistance and sacrifice that would inspire generations to come. Despite the loss at Thermopylae, the Greeks were far from defeated. The naval battle that would follow, the Battle of Salamis, would turn the tide in favor of the Greek city-states. The Battle of Salamis, a turning point. While Xerxes continued his march through Greece, the Greek city-states, led by Athens, formed a coalition to resist the Persian invasion. The Greek fleet, though smaller, was far more agile and strategically astute than the Persian fleet. The Greeks decided to confront the Persians in the waters around the island of Salamis, a narrow strait where the Persian fleet's size and numbers would work against them. In 480 BCE, the two fleets clashed in the Battle of Salamis, one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The Greek fleet, under the leadership of Themistocles, used clever tactics to lure the Persian ships into the narrow strait, where the larger Persian vessels were unable to maneuver effectively. The Greek triremes, faster and more maneuverable, decisively defeated the Persian fleet. With this loss, Xerxes' plans for a complete conquest of Greece were thrown into disarray. The victory at Salamis was a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian fleet, which had been the backbone of Xerxes' invasion, was shattered, and the Greeks gained a crucial advantage. Although Xerxes remained in Greece with a significant land force, the loss at Salamis severely weakened his position. The Battle of Plataea and the end of Persian ambitions in Greece. Following the naval defeat, Xerxes retreated, leaving behind a portion of his army to continue the campaign. In 479 BCE, the Greeks gathered a united force to confront the remaining Persian troops at the Battle of Plataea. The Persian forces, now under the command of Mardonius, fought against a coalition of Greek city-states led by Sparta and Athens. The Battle of Plataea marked the final significant engagement of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greek forces, particularly the Spartans, decisively defeated the Persians, killing Mardonius and scattering the remaining Persian troops. With the defeat at Plataea, the Persian Empire's ambitions in Greece came to an end. The Persian fleet, still battered from Salamis, was also decisively defeated in the Battle of Mycale, further cementing Greece's victory. The defeat of the Persian forces at Plataea and Mycale marked the end of Xerxes' campaign in Greece, and it was a massive blow to the Persian Empire. The Greek city-states, united by a common cause, had successfully repelled one of the most powerful empires in the world. In the wake of these defeats, Persia was forced to withdraw from Greece, and the dream of Persian domination over the Greek world was shattered. Aftermath and the long-term impact on the Persian Empire. Though Xerxes returned to Persia after his defeat in Greece, the loss at the hands of the Greeks had far-reaching consequences. The Persian Empire had suffered significant military and moral setbacks. While the empire would continue to thrive for several more decades, the war with Greece marked the beginning of a slow decline in Persian influence over the Mediterranean. Internally, Xerxes' reign was also marked by political unrest and rebellion in various parts of the empire. The Egyptian revolt, which had been a thorn in the side of the Persians for decades, would flare up again after the defeat in Greece, and other regions of the empire began to question Persian authority. Despite these challenges, the Persian Empire remained a formidable power, but it would no longer be the unstoppable force it had once been. Part 4. The Decline and Internal Struggles of the Persian Empire. The defeats suffered by Xerxes during the Greco-Persian Wars marked a turning point in the history of the Persian Empire. Though Persia had maintained its territorial integrity, the empire's military prowess and confidence were deeply shaken. The failure to conquer Greece had far-reaching implications not only for the empire's foreign policy but also for its internal stability. While the Persian Empire would endure for several more decades, its glory days were behind it. In the wake of Xerxes' reign, the Persian Empire would begin to experience internal strife, royal instability, and eventual decline. Xerxes' successors and the challenges of governance. After Xerxes' death in 465 BCE, his son Artaxerxes I ascended to the throne. Artaxerxes' reign began with significant challenges. Though he was able to stabilize the empire after his father's tumultuous reign, the empire's unity was continually threatened by rebellions and revolts in various provinces. Egypt, in particular, proved to be a continual thorn in the side of the Persian kings. In 460 BCE, Egypt revolted once again, leading to the restoration of Egyptian independence for a brief period. This rebellion was a significant setback for the Persians, as Egypt was a valuable province with both strategic and economic importance. Artaxerxes sent a military expedition to recapture Egypt, which was initially successful. However, the constant rebellions in Egypt, along with uprisings in other regions of the empire, exposed the growing difficulty of controlling such a vast and diverse empire. One of the most significant challenges Artaxerxes faced during his reign was the power struggle among the Persian elite. The court was rife with intrigue and rival factions within the royal family, and the nobility often vied for influence. While Artaxerxes managed to survive these challenges, the political instability at the heart of the empire was a precursor to the difficulties his successors would face. The Persian Empire and the rise of the Greek influence. Despite its internal struggles, the Persian Empire continued to be a significant force in the ancient world. However, the Greek city-states, having repelled the Persian invasion, began to grow in power and influence. The Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states led by Athens, began to challenge Persian dominance in the Aegean Sea. Athens, emboldened by its victory in the Greco-Persian Wars, grew stronger politically and economically, while Persian power in the region gradually weakened. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, between Athens and Sparta further complicated the situation for the Persians. Initially, the Persians saw the conflict as an opportunity to weaken both Athens and Sparta, as they supported one side or the other in the war. Persia provided financial support to the Spartans, helping them build a navy that would eventually defeat Athens. After Athens's defeat, Persia regained control of several key Greek cities, but this only further complicated relations with the Greek world. Even as Persian influence in the Aegean and beyond began to wane, the empire's core regions such as Mesopotamia, Persia, and Anatolia remained firmly under Persian rule. The vast empire still had enormous resources at its disposal, but the threat from the Greek city-states and the increasing challenges of governance began to take their toll. The reign of Darius II and the continued struggles. Darius II, who reigned from 423 to 404 BCE, would be the last of the Achaemenid kings to hold the empire together in anything resembling its former glory. His reign was marked by political infighting and widespread corruption within the royal court. Though Darius was able to hold off several challenges from rival factions, his inability to fully assert control over the empire's provinces allowed rebellions to persist. Internally, the empire's administration had become more fragmented, with satraps, provincial governors, increasingly acting with autonomy, sometimes disregarding the authority of the central government. Some satraps even began to engage in their own wars and power struggles, undermining the coherence and unity of the empire. Externally, the Persian Empire's ability to maintain influence in the Mediterranean region began to erode. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta, continued to flex their military and economic muscles, and Persian attempts to regain dominance in the region were increasingly unsuccessful. The Persians' involvement in the Peloponnesian War had drained resources and left them vulnerable to further Greek incursions. The decline of Persia's power. The death of Darius II in 404 BCE marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the power of the Achaemenid dynasty. His successor, Artaxerxes II, inherited an empire already struggling with internal divisions, revolts, and external pressures. While Artaxerxes II managed to maintain the empire for a time, he was unable to prevent further fragmentation and deterioration in central control. By the mid-4th century BCE, Persia faced multiple threats from within and without. Rebellions in Egypt, which had previously been a recurring issue, flared up again during the reign of Artaxerxes II and continued under his son, Artaxerxes III. The satraps of Asia Minor also sought more autonomy, which led to power struggles that weakened the central authority of the Persian throne. On the external front, the Persian Empire faced increasing challenges from the rising power of Macedonia under Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. The Macedonian military machine, with its highly trained army and innovative tactics, would eventually spell the end of the Achaemenid dynasty. The final confrontation, the rise of Alexander the Great. By the time of Artaxerxes III's reign in the late 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire was already in decline. The once great empire was now faced with a new threat, Alexander the Great, who had begun his conquest of the known world. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, determined to challenge the Persian Empire and fulfill his ambition of uniting the Greek world and defeating the long-standing Persian threat. The Persian Empire, despite its vast size, was increasingly unable to mount a successful defense against Alexander's rapid advance. The Macedonian army, known for its disciplined formations and exceptional cavalry, won a series of crushing victories against the Persians. The Battle of Granicus, 334 BCE, the Battle of Issus, 333 BCE, and, most decisively, the Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BCE, would seal the fate of the Persian Empire, the fall of the Persian Empire and the legacy of the Achaemenids. As the Persian Empire faced internal turmoil and external pressures in the 4th century BCE, the once mighty Achaemenid dynasty began to falter. Although the empire had controlled vast swathes of territory for centuries, from the Aegean to India, it was now confronted by a rising power from the west. That power was none other than Alexander the Great, whose conquests would ultimately bring an end to the Persian Empire and shift the balance of power in the ancient world forever. The demise of the Achaemenids would mark the end of an era, but their legacy would influence the regions they once ruled for centuries to come. The rise of Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, was the son of King Philip II of Macedon. Under the guidance of his father, who unified Greece and created a powerful military force, Alexander was groomed for leadership from an early age. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander ascended to the throne at just 20 years old. He inherited not only a unified and powerful Greece but also an ambition to extend Macedonian influence across the known world. Alexander's primary goal was to exact revenge on Persia for the invasions that had threatened Greece decades earlier. His mission, however, was not just one of vengeance, it was a grand, strategic conquest aimed at unifying the Greek city-states, securing Macedonia's power, and establishing his own legacy as a ruler of an empire that would stretch from Greece to India. With the support of his father's military apparatus, Alexander set out to fulfill his vision. In 334 BCE, he led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, beginning his campaign against the Persian Empire. The Battle of Granicus, 334 BCE. The first major engagement between Alexander and the Persian forces took place at the Battle of Granicus near the Hellespont in 334 BCE. The Persian satraps, local governors of the western provinces, gathered a large army to confront the Macedonian invasion. Although the Persian army outnumbered the Macedonian forces, they were unable to withstand Alexander's tactical brilliance. The Macedonian army, with its highly disciplined phalanx formation and elite cavalry, decisively defeated the Persians. The Battle of Granicus opened the path for Alexander's continued advance into Asia Minor. After this victory, he captured several key cities, including Sardis and Ephesus, securing his foothold in Anatolia. The rapid success of the Macedonian army sent shockwaves throughout the Persian Empire and marked the beginning of Alexander's relentless campaign against the Achaemenid dynasty. The Battle of Issus, 333 BCE. After his victories in Asia Minor, Alexander continued southward, pushing deeper into Persian territory. In 333 BCE, the Persian king Darius III, who had ascended the throne in 336 BCE, assembled a massive army to confront Alexander. The Battle of Issus, fought near the modern-day Turkish-Syrian border, became one of the defining moments of Alexander's campaign. Darius's forces were vast, but Alexander's tactical ingenuity once again proved to be the deciding factor. The Macedonian army was able to exploit the terrain and outmaneuver the Persians, forcing Darius to retreat. The battle ended in a decisive victory for Alexander, with Darius fleeing the battlefield, leaving behind his family and a vast amount of treasure. The victory at Issus was a major blow to the Persians and marked the beginning of Alexander's domination of the eastern Mediterranean. Following his triumph, Alexander captured key cities in Syria and Palestine, including the strategically important city of Tyre, which had defied his forces. His victory in the region ultimately led to his control over the Levant and Egypt. The Siege of Tyre and the founding of Alexandria, 332 BCE. In 332 BCE, Alexander laid siege to the city of Tyre, a formidable Phoenician city located on an island off the coast of modern Lebanon. Tyre was heavily fortified and considered one of the greatest naval powers of the time, making it a crucial stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The city's refusal to surrender to Alexander became a matter of pride for the Macedonian king, who relentlessly pursued its capture. After a 7-month siege, Alexander's forces managed to breach the city's defenses by constructing a causeway to reach the island. The fall of Tyre marked the end of Phoenician naval power in the region and allowed Alexander to secure dominance over the eastern Mediterranean coast. Following this victory, Alexander marched southward into Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator by the Egyptians. In Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Alexandria would become a hub of culture, commerce, and learning, and it would remain a key center of knowledge throughout the Hellenistic period. The Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BCE. The final confrontation between Alexander and the Persian Empire took place in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq. Darius III had raised another enormous army to defend the heart of his empire, but this time Alexander's forces would not be denied. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Alexander's tactical brilliance and the discipline of his troops once again turned the tide of battle in his favor. At Gaugamela, Alexander deployed his forces in a way that maximized their effectiveness, exploiting gaps in the Persian line and using his cavalry to strike decisively. The Persian army, despite its size and the presence of war elephants, was routed. Darius III fled the battlefield once again, this time never to return. The Battle of Gaugamela marked the final collapse of the Achaemenid dynasty, the fall of Persepolis, and the end of the Persian Empire. After his victory at Gaugamela, Alexander pursued Darius across the Persian Empire. Darius was eventually betrayed and murdered by his own men in 330 BCE. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid Empire effectively came to an end. Alexander, now the master of Persia, moved on to capture the Persian capital of Persepolis in 330 BCE. The city, which had once stood as a symbol of the wealth and power of the Persian kings, was looted and burned by Alexander's forces. The fall of Persepolis was both symbolic and practical, as it represented the destruction of the Persian Empire's heart. The loss of such an iconic city, along with the death of Darius III, marked the official end of the Achaemenid dynasty and the Persian Empire. The legacy of the Persian Empire. Though the Persian Empire was no more, its legacy endured in the territories Alexander conquered. The Achaemenids had established a vast, multi-ethnic empire that contributed to the development of a shared cultural and administrative framework across much of the ancient world. Their achievements in governance, infrastructure, and commerce influenced the development of future empires, including Alexander's own Hellenistic kingdoms. Additionally, Persian culture left an indelible mark on the regions that came under Greek control. The blending of Greek and Persian cultures in the wake of Alexander's conquests, known as Hellenistic culture, would have far-reaching effects on art, science, philosophy, and politics throughout the ancient world. The legacy of the Persian Empire and its influence on the ancient world. With the death of Darius III in 330 BCE and the fall of Persepolis, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was effectively brought to an end. Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia marked the conclusion of centuries of Persian dominance in the ancient world. However, the legacy of the Persian Empire did not end with its downfall. The impact of the Achaemenid dynasty on the civilizations that succeeded it, particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms that arose after Alexander's death, was profound and lasting. The Hellenistic Empire and the fusion of cultures. After the death of Alexander in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his generals, known as the Diadochi, who fought for control of the vast territories he had conquered. The Persian lands fell under the control of Seleucus I Nicator, who founded the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids, like Alexander, inherited the Persian administrative structure and much of the Persian cultural influence, and they sought to blend Greek and Persian traditions into a new, hybrid Hellenistic culture. Under Seleucid rule, cities such as Antioch and Seleucia grew into major centers of trade, culture, and learning. The Persian influence on these cities was still evident as Greek and Persian art, architecture, and political systems fused. The Achaemenid style of governance, with its system of satraps, governors, managing local regions, was incorporated into the new empire alongside Greek military tactics and strategies. This fusion of Greek and Persian traditions would go on to shape the Hellenistic world and influence future empires. The influence on successor states. Beyond the Seleucid Empire, the legacy of the Persian Empire continued to reverberate in the successor states that emerged in the wake of Alexander's death. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, established by one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, inherited elements of Persian governance. The Ptolemies, like the Seleucids, maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy, utilizing Persian-inspired administrative techniques to govern their vast empire. In India, Alexander's conquests had exposed the Persian Empire's cultural and administrative practices to the subcontinent, leaving a lasting impact on Indian governance and art. Persian elements in the architecture of the Maurya Empire, as well as in the coins and inscriptions of Indian rulers, indicate a significant exchange of ideas between the two cultures. Moreover, even the Roman Empire, which would rise to prominence in the centuries following Alexander's death, was influenced by the Persian model of governance. Roman emperors often modeled their courts after the Achaemenid royal court, adopting Persian-style ceremonial practices and regalia. The concept of an emperor as a divine ruler, derived from Persian kingship, also had a lasting impact on Roman imperial ideology. Cultural and intellectual legacy. Beyond politics and governance, the cultural legacy of the Persian Empire was also significant. Persian literature, art, and architecture continued to influence the cultures that succeeded the empire. One of the most enduring contributions of the Persians was their system of road building and infrastructure, epitomized by the Royal Road, which stretched from Susa in Persia to Sardis in Asia Minor. This network of roads facilitated communication, trade, and the movement of armies, not only during the Achaemenid period but also long after the empire's fall. In terms of intellectual achievements, the Persian Empire fostered a rich tradition of science, mathematics, and astronomy. The Persian scholars in the ancient world played a key role in preserving and transmitting knowledge from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, particularly in the fields of mathematics and astronomy. The Persian contribution to the development of the zodiac, which would later be incorporated into Greek and Roman systems, is just one example of how Persian scholarship impacted subsequent civilizations. Additionally, Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of the Achaemenid Empire, continued to influence religious thought for centuries. Zoroastrian ideas about dualism, the nature of good and evil, and the concept of a final judgment were incorporated into the religious philosophies of both the Greek and Roman worlds. The influence of Zoroastrianism can also be seen in later monotheistic religions, such as Christianity and Islam, both of which absorbed aspects of Zoroastrian teachings over time. The end of Persian rule and the rise of the Sassanids. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Persia would not remain under foreign rule for long. The Seleucid Empire eventually weakened, and by the mid-3rd century BCE, a new Persian dynasty, the Parthians, rose to power in Iran. The Parthian Empire, which lasted from 247 BCE to 224 CE, successfully resisted Roman expansion and revived many elements of the Persian political and military systems. The Parthians upheld the ideals of Persian kingship, and their empire served as a bridge between the ancient Persian world and the emerging Islamic empires. The Parthians were eventually supplanted by the Sassanid dynasty, which came to power in 224 CE. The Sassanid Empire was a direct continuation of the Achaemenid legacy, seeking to restore Persian imperial power to its former glory. Under the Sassanids, Persia became one of the most powerful empires in the world, rivaling the Byzantine Empire to the west and engaging in both military and cultural exchanges with India, China, and the Greco-Roman world. The Sassanid Empire would continue the Persian tradition of centralized rule, promoting Zoroastrianism as the state religion and strengthening the Persian cultural identity.
So we've explored the rise and fall of 5 of the most powerful empires in history, each leaving an unforgettable legacy. The Mongol Empire had unmatched military speed and the largest continuous land empire. The Roman Empire shaped law, governance, and architecture for centuries. The Ottoman Empire ruled for over 600 years, bridging Europe and Asia. The Persian Empire was a pioneer in administration and culture, while the British Empire became the largest in history, influencing the modern world. But the big question remains, which empire do you think was the most powerful? Was it the ruthless Mongols, the organized Romans, or maybe the far-reaching British? Let us know in the comments below. We're excited to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the world's most fascinating stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.